Chapter 76, The Holy Mountain Part 2. Sisters, that's the Holy Mountain. We've found it. Kara screamed to let out her overwhelming joy. Many of the witches stayed in place, frozen in wonder. Others embraced their companions around them. However, Scarlet wrinkled her eyebrows. Is that really Holy Mountain? What's the matter? Is there anything wrong? Asked Leaf, whispering. The same question echoed in her mind. The city and the sky looked unlike those in the ancient texts, which were glittering and magnificent. Although the spires were spectacular, the whole of it was grey and black, and even in the day, it was dull. Not to mention the city was filled with a thick red mist akin to blood. There is something crowding in those caves. Scarlet's voice was a bit dry. I can't see it clearly, but those things don't resemble gods. A layer of goosebumps rose all over Leaf. Scarlet could see the farthest out of the members of the Witch Cooperation Association, and the way that she spoke made Leaf uneasy. Unfortunately, Lightning had left with Nightingale, or else she could have flown closer to look. Sisters, Holy Mountain lies before us. The mentor waved her hands as she shouted. Just a bit further, and we'll find our eternity. She immediately urged Stone to move her forward. Leaf wanted to step forward to stop them, but her feet stopped her. She remembered what happened to Wendy 2 weeks ago. She was afraid that if she discouraged them, it would not make sense to the respected mentor, and she would not stop. The walking women began to speed up. After leaving the foot of the mountain, the snow seemed to get lower and the surrounding temperature also raised. This is what was forbidden in legend, a place where humans can't step, Leaf thought, but there are footprints in this no man's land. If Lightning was here, would she be joyful? Looking back, the towering mountains behind her rose and fell, like a barrier that could not be crossed. Leaf could not help but guess that it was precisely because of the impassable mountain range that the demonic beasts could not directly attack the hinterland, but rather must pass through the northernmost regions. If they could somehow find Holy Mountain, no matter the method, they would not have to wonder any longer and could have peace. She gently sighed. To tell the truth, she was moved when Nightingale spoke to the Cooperation about all that she had seen and heard in Border Town. When Wendy asked who wanted to leave with Nightingale, she could not help but try to move forward and tell her name. But until the end, she still failed to cross the heart of the threshold, and she was left as a shadow of the past. Leaf shook her head. She did not want to think about things that had already passed. She moved to keep up with the group and crossed the yellow and white line into the wilderness. However, it was not long before strange things began to happen. No matter how they sped up, the city retreated at the same speed. After 2 hours, the Holy Mountain was still in the clouds, neither smaller nor bigger. It was as if they had not moved at all. Respected mentor, let us rest. Our sisters are tired, said Stone. Over this period, a number of women had carried the mentor, but Stone had kept it up the longest. No, how could we stop now? Kara refused the suggestion without hesitating. This is the test from the deities, sisters. If there's no firm will, we can never reach Holy Mountain. We can't stop. We must continue until the gates of Holy Mountain appear before us. Seeing that persuasion was futile, the women marched forward. However, the situation did not change, and while wandering the witches also encountered 2 waves of demonic beasts. The second wave consisted of 2 deformed beasts. Leaf created long weeds to trap the beast, but it could not stop one of her sisters from being hurt and bleed. The monsters were finally killed and the crowd found that the sky was gradually darkening. Twilight had approached. The city remained in front of them, but the silhouette seemed to fade, like the city itself was disappearing. According to their past experience, they must find suitable camping place to set up a camp. However, this area was completely different from the impassable mountain range, which seemed to be almost flat and was littered with the occasional demonic beasts. They simply could not stay there overnight. Respected mentor, we must return to the foot of the mountain. Let Scarlet lead the way, with red light lighting the path. Then maybe we can make it back by midnight. No! Kara shouted, We've spent all the afternoon coming here without stopping. At this point, we've spent more than half of our strength and it'd be impossible to return at the same speed. Sisters, let us move on. We'll rest once we've reached Holy Mountain. How about Sherry? People asked, pointing to a witch who had collapsed lifeless on the ground. We've no time to bury her. The instructor shook her head and said, leave her here. The earth will take her. Leaf closed her eyes in sadness. A sister had left them. If she had had more strength, then she would not have needed to die in this desolate land where even a tombstone could not be left. As the crowd sat there undecided as to whether they should move on or retreat, Stone suddenly exclaimed, look at the sky, the city is gone. Leaf opened her eyes, looked up, and saw that the sky had become grey-black. The clouds had hidden in the night, and with them, the city had disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never existed. Everyone stood still, and for a while, there was a terrible silence. There was the city you could never get, for it was an image floating in the air, and when the sun fell the illusion vanished. Leaf suddenly remembered a story from Lightning's adventures about those at sea who saw bizarre fantasies. She shivered. We were cheated. She whispered before shouting, we were cheated, it was not Holy Mountain. What we saw was a mirage. A mirage. Kara looked back, her face terrifyingly ferocious. What's that? Lightning mentioned in a story that this phenomenon often occurs on voyages, but on the land is much rarer. All we saw was a phantom. The real city may be far away from us if it's not even there at all. Does that mean that it does exist and just teleported? Leaf was stifled. I don't know. At this point, Scarlet suddenly called out, warning them, be careful. Something is coming. She stared at something moving on the left, and her face was disgusted. Are they demonic beasts? Windseeker crouched, ready to fight. How many are there? No. Scarlet took 2 steps back, I don't know what it is. As she spoke, a shadow closed in at lightning speed directly towards Scarlet. Although she saw the light enclosed by shadow, she could not dodge the bolt. It was just too fast. In the blink of an eye, the shadow pierced through Scarlet's chest, making her fly backward. She was nailed to the trunk. It was a spear. Chapter 77, The Holy Mountain Part 3. Leaf felt her whole body was frozen. On her left 2 shadows came out from the night, bulky and peculiar, different than the normal visage of a demonic beast. And then Leaf saw that there were 2 figures riding on the backs of the mixed species. They were tall, twice the size of a normal person. They wore no armor but the clothes of some indescribable material. No, one would be reluctant to call it clothes. It was as if they were wrapped from head to toe in a swollen animal skin, bulging in many places. And yet the most striking thing about the 2 figures was the 2 masks they were wearing. They were obviously transformed heads of demonic beasts, ferocious and terrible. Their eyes with reddish-brown crystals dug into their skulls. A full patch of leather on their head seemed to be peeled back, running down their back in shells. One man was equipped with a few spears on their mount, another with strangely shaped iron gloves. From the look of it, the iron glove only had 3 fingers. Only one word hung in Leaf's head, demon. Enemies. Kara's harsh screaming pulled all the attention back to the enemy. Stone placed her hand on the ground, turning the snowy land in front of them into a large swamp. This was the correct response. The mounts were hybrid wolf beasts with wings. They were not only fast but could fly for short distances. However, these 2 obviously could not. Their wings had been cut off. Hemp rope was tied onto their bare bones, which were held by the demons riding them. Therefore they could not fly over the swamp but would have to cross over it. This would give the sisters time. However, the enemy did not act as expected. Rather, they drove the mounts forward, entering the swamp. Then, by the impulse, the demonic beast leapt into the sky, jumping across the remaining distance, right to the place where the non-combat type witches were gathered. Spread out, quick. Leaf's voice had not fallen before the iron-handed demon wearing the 3-fingered iron gloves was already killing the witches in the crowd. His degree of agility did not match his body at all. The witch close to him did not have time to react and was punched in the head. Then there were another two sisters that the iron-handed demon pinched on the neck. The others were alerted and ran about in panic. It was only Shino that stood still. Even though her ability was not suitable for fighting, she did not turn away, but rather drew the crossbow from her back and took aim at the creature. The iron-handed demon dodged to the side, lifted its feet to send her flying. Along with the rush of power came a muffled sound. The little girl was sprawled on the ground and clotted blood flowed through her mouth. The spear-wielding demon turned around, walking towards the terrified Stone. Right when he was about to pierce the witch through the chest, flames erupted in front of him. Red light rolled between his legs, grabbing Stone's hands and running. Their opponent attempted to catch up but was stopped by a black wall of gas. Leaf poured all of her power into the earth, causing all sorts of plants to appear out of it. Thorny vines wrapped around, climbing the iron-handed demon. Kara summoned the demonic snake pain that bit into the iron-handed demon's arm. When he waved his hands to get rid of the snake, the vines fluttered and captured his feet, tugging them backward and causing the heavy body to crash to the ground. "Run, sisters, run!" shouted Leaf, her voice shaking in fear. "Escape, fast! Hurry away from these terrible monsters. They are recorded in the ancient texts as sources of evil, demons that have appeared out of the gates of hell." The poison from the demonic snake seemed to be ineffective. The iron-handed demon fell to the ground, who seemed to want to grab the vines that had scratched at him. The spear-wielding demon saw his companion's difficulty and was soon focused on Leaf, who was controlling the vines. He lifted a spear, getting into position to throw it, his arms quickly swelling. The original bulging skin was stretched to a thin layer, and even through it, one could see blood vessels and dark bones. "Leaf, watch out!" Stone once again turned the ground into a quagmire, this time directly casting herself at her opponent. The spear-wielding demon suddenly sank down, and the spear he had thrown instantly changed direction, inserting diagonally into the ground in front of Leaf. A section of the spear as tall as a person was submerged into the ground. Leaf burst out in a cold sweat. After throwing the spear, the swollen arm shrunk rapidly, quickly becoming something similar to a drywood. The spear-wielding demon could not throw spears now. She immediately realized that it was a good time to escape. She was not alone in this. Stone, Red Light, and Windseeker, who had been struggling with the iron-handed demon, ran to the careless Kara. They wished to bring Mentor Kara to leave with them. Only Leaf saw the iron-handed demon pull at the vines to reach out to the three women. What is he trying to do? Wait. No. But she was too late to warn them, as a line of blue light came from the iron-handed demon's hands. It was like a bolt of lightning piercing the sky and twisted to hit the three sisters. The blue bolt jumped between the three women, crackling. Their bodies went up in white smoke, and they fell to the ground, with their robes burning behind them. The attack seemed to consume the great effort of the enemy, and with heavy breathing, he stopped moving. At this time, Leaf's magic power had hit its limit. The vines disintegrated and changed, turning quickly into withering weeds. Everything is over, she thought. The Mentor's desperate shouting faded as if she had grown far away as the strength of her body faded like a tide. She fell to the ground helplessly. After resting for a mere moment, the iron-handed demon slowly climbed up from the snow. No one could stop him this time as he went to stand in front of the horrified Kara. The demon stretched out his hand to choke the throat of the Mentor, who wanted desperately to break free from the creature's fingers, but it was meaningless in this desperate state. Struggling, she sent the demonic snake out and it bit the enemy's arm and neck, but the iron-handed demon was unmoved but continued to grip tighter. As this was happening, one demonic snake bit the iron-handed demon's leather hose under its head. Red mist sprayed from the fissure, revealing tendons and bones. The iron-handed demon issued a terrible scream, the skin quickly fouling under the red fog, revealing tendons and bones. Even though he released his iron hand after this and tried to block the tube in panic, the fog quickly dissipated and his body began to tremble. He fell to the ground, motionless. The spear-wielding demon with half its body buried in the swamp shouted. Leaf had never heard such a voice. It was like a sharp scream and a low roar together, and it hurt her ears. But the enemy's roar did not make Leaf flee, rather it gave her the will to win. Biting her lips, she struggled to stand up and picked up the crossbow that she now fell. Reloading it, she went in front of the spear-wielding demon. The spear-wielding demon obviously understood what she wanted to do, its two arms desperately waving. But in the swamp, the more you struggled, the faster you would sink. He tried to block it from entering his lungs, but the part of his windpipe that extended into his shell was exposed. This is for my lost sisters, Leaf thought. Aiming at the tube, she pulled the trigger. The crossbow bolt hit its mark, and red mist spurted out where she had hit. When it sprayed, the opponent's head fell. She had killed the demon. Leaving the crossbow, Leaf looked back at the more than a dozen of her sisters that had lost their lives. She fell to the ground and burst into tears. Chapter 78, The Companionship. Wendy opened her eyes and saw an unfamiliar ceiling above her. There were cobwebs draping from the wooden beams. The ceiling was made up of grey bricks and had an unlit, circular chandelier. Slowly, the image turned from cloudy to clear until she could see every detail. It's not a cold rocky roof or narrow tent. Oh right, I've left the Witch Cooperation Association for more than half a month. I wonder if Mentor had successfully led the sisters to the discovery of Holy Mountain, Wendy thought. She took a deep breath. Although the air in the room was not as clean and fresh as that in a cave, its dullness and warmth made her comfortable. Her body was wrapped in a soft velvet quilt, and the layers of cotton blankets under her sank slightly every time she lay on them. Even if she stretched her body fully, her toes wouldn't be exposed. She felt a little guilty at the thought of lazing on the bed. Even though she had only arrived for half a month, she felt a sense of peace. It was something that she had not experienced in a long time. In the castle, no one would disturb her no matter how late she got up. Just like today. Wendy turned to look out of the window and noticed that the grey sky was a little glaring. It seemed over 10 a.m. in her past wandering life. She did not have such a comfortable sleep before. She would be woken by the faintest sounds and had to prepare food before dawn. During that time, the witches had lived in the fear of being discovered by the church or dying in the next demonic torture. Even while hiding in the impassable mountain range, Wendy was always busy with the many chores. She had to help with seasoning the dried food and herbs, drying her sister's laundry, or cleaning the camp and so on. Wendy did not mind doing these works and felt happy when seeing the smile on everyone's faces. Yet, she could not resist the lazy life now. Unexpectedly, she was enjoying it. Clapping her face, Wendy pushed herself up and tried her best to get out of the bed. When she was in the convent, Mother Superior had always warned that God would never bless those who were lazy. Wendy could not hold back her smiles whenever she thought of His Highness' requirements for her training. These were odd and eccentric requirements, such as asking her to control the wind 10 meters above her head after he had seen her performance. However, a witch could never extend the power as far as he required. Nevertheless, the prince wasn't angry when she had admitted that it was beyond her abilities. Instead, he had come up with a strange idea, standing on a stool and blowing the wind from the top and the bottom at the same time. After trying, Wendy found this a practical solution. The test result pleased His Highness very much. In addition to asking Wendy to practice more, he also asked her if she was afraid of heights. Just as Nightingale described, Roland Wimbledon was indeed an unpredictable person. Yet, he was also a prince who cared about witches. Wendy sighed softly at the thought. After she put on the new robe, she felt that it was a little tight at the chest. Wendy had been accustomed to it. When she was looking for the sewing kit to mend the cloth, there was a knock at the door. "Come in." It was Nightingale. Wendy was somewhat amazed and laughed. "Is His Highness still in bed? It's surprising that you have time to see me." "What are you talking about? I don't have time to follow him all day." Nightingale lifted the basket in her hand. "I've brought you some breakfast." Usually, it was the maid who served the breakfast to her room. Wendy had barely seen and talked to Nightingale except when the prince was asleep. She smiled in her heart. Wendy knew that Nightingale must have sneaked in to check if she had woken up and came in as soon as she was out of bed. "Go ahead, what's up?" She took over the basket and put a piece of bread filled with cheese into her mouth. Nightingale walked to the bedside and sat down. "Today is the day for Nana." Wendy was speechless. She knew that although the first bite of magic power was not as fierce and long as the one in the day of adulthood, the witch was not completely safe. The younger a witch was, the less the pain she could endure. Wendy placed the basket on the bedside cabinet and walked to Nightingale. She clapped her shoulder and comforted her. "Didn't His Highness say that as long as the witch released her power every day, the torture would minimize?" "It was just a hypothesis. At least it sounds reasonable," Wendy went on. "Anna has been through it this way, hasn't she? She was safe even on the deadliest day of adulthood, and you've seen it with your own eyes." She paused and continued, "Where is Nana?" "She is at the hospital." As she was talked, Nightingale could not hold back her smile. "I heard that her father, Baron Pine, has bought a lot of hares from hunters and sent them to the medical center. Nana will get to practice with them until tomorrow." "It's nice to have such a father," Wendy said enviously. "I don't remember anything about my childhood, which is very strange. It was like a memory gap. I don't have father or mother, and all the memories begin with the time when I was in the convent. Looks like I'm a little more fortunate than you." "Yeah, much more fortunate." Wendy sat close beside her. "Are you nervous?" Nightingale remained silent for a while and nodded. Of course, Wendy knew what she was nervous about. Today was not only of paramount importance to Nana but also a vital turning point for the fate of all witches. If she could get through the bite safely, it meant that all witches would be free from being called the Devil's minions, and Border Town undoubtedly would be their holy mountain. A day would come where all witches would gather here, living a life just like ordinary people without a need to move around to hide from the church. "There's no use worrying. Let's take a day off to stay with Nana." "A day off?" Nightingale looked at Wendy with wide eyes. "Yes, telling me the news so early is making me as nervous as you," Wendy said bluntly. "Since we're not in the mood for training, let's go and see Nana." "Isn't that written in the contract?" "It's called a paid leave." After dinner, Nana's chamber was crowded with people. Anna, Lightning, Nightingale, Wendy, Tagi, and Roland. Seeing all these people, the young girl looked bewildered. Am I going to die?" "Of course not." All of them shook their heads. "The intensity of bite at the first time will be not very strong." Wendy held Nana's right hand and said, "Stay focused, you can manage it. Grasp my hands when it hurts." Tagi shook her daughter's left hand and said, "You've grown much stronger at the hospital. I'm so proud of you." The young girl nodded. She looked through the crowd until her eyes fell on Anna. Anna walked over and kissed her forehead. "Stay alive, okay, yeah." Chapter 79, The Answer. All the curtains were drawn, and the fire blazed in the hearth, keeping the temperature in the chamber warm. Unlike Anna, Nana was awake on her day of adulthood. To help her focus more quickly before the pain fell on her, everyone stayed with her, telling stories or playing simple games, to keep her awake. Roland showed off some coin magic tricks, surprising everyone, especially Nana, who stared at his hands without blinking. On a normal day, she would have asked him to teach her. The magic of this age was vaudeville. Roland had watched it in the palace. It included the snake dancing to the flute, fire breathing, crushing a stone plate on one's chest and so on. It seemed less appealing compared to the elaborate modern magic that focused on camouflage and tricks of the fingers. Lightning shared her adventurous sailing stories. She talked about sailing with her father, Thunder, through isles and fjords, crossing vortexes and reefs and hunting deep-water sharks and octopuses. Everyone was charmed by the stories, despite knowing that a large part of it was made up. Roland could not help dreaming of it. In his imagination, the sailing ship turned into an ironclad battleship that sailed through the open sea and approached new land. In fact, He lacked in understanding the history of this world where the clear record only went back to 450 years ago. He had never caught any reason for this from the knowledge that the prince had learned from his court mentor. Maybe he had not paid any attention to it during class, Roland thought. Moreover, there was no archive or library in Border Town. He decided he would ask some maesters once he had taken Long Song's stronghold. When Lightning's story was finished, Roland could not help yawning. He turned his eyes to Nightingale, who shook her head, meaning the magic power had not changed. The lack of timepieces made it incredibly inconvenient to track time. Roland poured himself some warm water, sat down and continued to wait. But as time went on, all of them sensed something unusual. The process was taking too long. Nana had been yawning all night, too tired to keep awake. Anxiety grew in Nightingale, who touched the young girl's forehead, as she watched the flow of magic power in her body. To his surprise, a glimmer had emerged on the horizon of the dark sky. "Look!" Roland drew back the curtain. Everyone turned at his shout. Looking at the dim light far on the horizon, they all realized that a new day had come. Nana had passed her day of the bite of magic power safely. Roland stretched himself and headed back to his chamber, where he found two unexpected visitors. It was Nightingale and Wendy. Their faces were not sleepy at all but filled with excitement. "Are you really sure that today, no, last night was the day for Nana?" Roland asked. "Yes, but the change was too small for me to confirm the vital moment of the bite," Nightingale said firmly. "Your Highness, you're right. By regularly releasing power, the gross power will increase, but the pain we suffer will be less. If we keep training for a specific number of hours every day, all witches will stand a chance to survive their day of adulthood. In the entire kingdom of Grey Castle, your land is the only place where witches can use their powers freely. This means, in a sense, that this is Holy Mountain we've been pursuing." Wendy went on. "I want to beg you to inform more witches of the news and bring them to this holy land. I'm sure they'll be glad to serve you." "This is what I intend to do." Roland nodded. "My subjects will partially understand and have contact with witches after the months of demons. That'll be the right time to spread the news, by way of spreading rumors. You should know that I can't publicly recruit witches in an open and expansive way. It would provoke a great disturbance in the realm." He paused for a moment. "Unless the church becomes extinct or I take the throne. Then I'll assist you to take the throne." It seemed that Wendy had been waiting for those words, and she kneeled to pledge her fealty. Roland could tell from her unskilled movements that maybe she had just learned the curtsy. Yet none of the details mattered. He accepted her fealty in the same way that he had accepted Nightingale's. Wendy stood up and smiled at Nightingale. "How am I doing?" Nightingale curled her lips. "After a fashion." Roland could not help but shake his head. "You should go to bed. You've been up all night." "Your Highness, I want to ask for one more thing." Wendy, who had just stood up and kneeled again. "Go on," Roland said seriously, his smile fading. He could tell from her stance that it would be a difficult promise for him to make. "I want to go back to the camp again." Wendy. Astonished, Nightingale stared at Wendy, whose eyes were filled with determination. "I don't know whether they've found Holy Mountain. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I hope to leave for the impassable mountain range after the months of demons. If Kara can't find Holy Mountain, they should be back in the mountains by then. That would be most perilous." Roland frowned. "Your respected mentor attacked you with no mercy. If she had really wanted to kill me, I would be dead," Wendy said. She summoned the demonic snake of suffering, not that of death. "Maybe few or even none will come back here with me, but at least I can bring the news to my sisters that releasing power every day will save them from the dreadful pain." Her voice softened at this point. "Your Highness, as long as you treat witches well as always, my life belongs to you." "I'll never treat my life lightly. I'll keep safe. Please promise me." Roland remained silent. He should turn down Wendy's request for her safety. But he knew what the request meant to her. She would risk anything to save more witches. If Roland turned her down, She may still obey his command, but yet the death of her sisters, caused by his refuse, would scar her. I promise you. Roland nodded at last. Go with lightning 2 months after the months of demons has passed. Just in case, I'll offer you the flintlock and God's stone of retaliation. Promise me that you'll wear it when negotiating with Kara or other witches. And lightning will stand by too so that they can't hurt you with their power. Your Highness, please let me go with her. Nightingale said. No, Veronica. His Highness' safety is far more important. All witches' hopes now lie with him. Wendy smiled. Take good care of him. Chapter 80, The Artillery Squad. A week after the concrete ship was placed in the curing room, the day to launch the vessel finally arrived. All the workers were left stunned when the prince ordered to put this oversized bathtub that had taken them a lot of work into the water, making everyone wonder whether they had misheard him. However, that was indeed Roland's order. He had people temporarily dismantle the shed and had them dug a slope below the concrete boat, leading into the river. This part had to be handled with great caution because of the weak tensile strength of the cement products. A few cracks would not cause a problem, but in case it hit the ground that would be enough to destroy the whole vessel. The ship was placed on top of logs and the speed at which it slid would be controlled by ropes. When everything was prepared, the workers let the wrist-thick rope slowly slide through their hands, making sure that it would always point in a straight line. While the workers were shouting their slogan in sync, the vessel slowly slid over the logs, creating an intense sound of friction. Fortunately, everything went well, and Roland could see the boat slowly slipping into the river. The boat sank nearly half a meter into the water, with more than 1 meter staying above the surface. The workers were extremely surprised to see that this massive stone and metal-made construction would not directly sink into the riverbed with a loud noise, but instead it floated on the surface like a leaf. Hurry, take the ropes and tie them tight around the bollards. Roland ordered. If the ship was not tied to the bollards, the current of the river would carry the concrete boat southwards. Although Nightingale did not show herself, she still was not able to stop herself from asking in a voice full of surprise, "Why does the boat float?" "Well, it's quite simple. The boat's average density is lower than that of the water, and this is the reason it can float on water," explained Roland, and after a moment of thinking, and he added, "The fact that the boat is built out of iron and concrete doesn't matter. In fact, you must have understood it from the sailing ship that was huge and weighed much more than a stone." Since he did not hear her voice again, Roland assumed that she was still comprehending what he had said. Even Anna was not able to immediately understand the concept he had just explained. Roland smiled and continued to direct the workers to move on. The subsequent hardening of the concrete took a lot of time, and by the time it began to snow heavily, the work had to be stopped. Only when the snowfall was minimum, were they able to continue their work. The most time-consuming task was the construction of the deck, which was built out of many wooden planks, and supported by many small stakes which were placed between the bottom and the deck. Although this was a waste of space, taking into account the primary purpose of the concrete boat, it did not matter much. Next, it was time for the corrosion-proofing. The carpenters knew very well how to do this. First they brushed a layer of oil with a pungent smell onto the deck. When the oil had dried, they repeated this procedure with red oil several times until it was finally coated with a red paint. Once the deck construction was completed, the installation phase of the upper building began. As for the so-called upper part, it was just a wooden shed which was placed between the two masts, and which later would be used to store cannons and ammunition. In case of a rainy day, the shed could also be utilized by the crew as a shelter. A platform was added at the top of the roof where a person could stand, obviously created for Wendy. As long as she stood on the roof, the range of her magic ability would be enough to cover the entire sail. The stern rudder was made of pig iron, and its installation was a bit troublesome. The tiller had to go through a reserved hole under the water, and then appear again on the deck, where an iron ring would be put on it. The buckle was a right-angled triangle plate, with a long side welded on the tiller, and the short side could freely rotate in the groove of the iron ring. The welding was naturally done by Anna, who was also astonished and puzzled by the fact that a stone bathtub could float on the water. Thus, she also asked the same questions as Nightingale. So Roland repeated his answer and watched Anna went aside and sat down to think about it. Well, the task of universal education still had a long way to go. On the other side, Vaina was still trying to decide whether to join the artillery squad or to stay with the flintlock squad. Everything started with that order 3 days ago. His Highness decided to transfer out some members of the 1st and 2nd militia team, who performed exceptionally, to build a new elite force. When Vaina's name was called, he felt very pleased. But when Ionax asked him if he wanted to join the flintlock squad or the new artillery squad, he felt confused. He was aware of the new flintlock, which was effective in the fight against the demonic beasts, with its penetrating power much stronger than that of a hand crossbow. Currently, only Ionax, the chief knight, and a number of senior hunters were allowed to use this deadly weapon. Vaina was supposed to join the flintlock squad without any hesitation, but instead, he could not help himself asking, "What's a cannon?" When he found out that a cannon was 10 times larger than a flintlock and that its power was 100 times stronger than the strength of a flintlock, he fell into a dilemma. Apparently, the ability to use a more powerful weapon could prove one's own value for His Highness. So joining the artillery seemed to be the better option of the two. However, the advantage of carrying a flintlock was that it was possible to carry it while walking through the town, attracting the eyes of the people, which was always Vaina's dream. Even though the cannon's power was 10 times that of a flintlock, surely it would not be possible to carry such a powerful weapon while walking through the streets, right? By the last day of the deadline, he finally decided to join the artillery squad. The last point that affected his decision was that the salary of an artillery soldier was 5 silver royals higher. Afterwards, began the rigorous training. The operation of a cannon requires 5 people, and Job, Cat's Claw, Nelson and Rodney were assigned to Vaina's team. Since Vaina was previously a vice-captain within the spear squad, he was now appointed as the artillery captain. Compared to flintlocks, the cannon was 10 times more troublesome. For almost a month, Vaina had secretly observed how Ionax operated his flintlock. He was sure he was able to memorize the operation of a flintlock without mistake. As for the cannon, a series of complicated operations were required in order to switch it from transportation mode to firing mode. Stopping the horse, pulling out the pin, pulling the hook, moving the cannon cart, pushing it towards the shooting spot, putting down the crutch, all these processes required 5 people to cooperate in tandem. For example, when pulling the hook, the other ones had to push the support cart right away from the cannon, turning it from a 4-wheel vehicle into a 2-wheel vehicle, so that the cannon's crutch would drop to the ground. During the process the cooperation should be perfect, or else it would be hard to separate the heavy cannon from the cart. After settling the position came the load of ammunition, and ready to fire. The firing process was quite similar to the flintlock, but the cleanup of the cannon after its usage requires 2 different mops. The ammunition would also be packaged properly and could be inserted directly in the cannon. The firing method was done through gunpowder line ignition. It would be hard to display its power when it rained, Vaina thought. Fortunately, as an artillery captain, most of the time he just stood aside and ordered the others to do the job, which saved him a lot of energy. For the first 3 days, the 4 newly selected artillery teams had only 1 cannon to train with. So under the command of Ionax, all the groups had to go through the process of stopping the mount, unloading the cannon, preparing it to shoot, loading the cannon on a cart and then restart the whole process. These steps were always repeated, and Vaina even suspected that with the continuous cleaning of the cannon would be even cleaner than his own face. Chapter 81, The Artillery Training. Every day Vaina's group had to train for 2 to 3 hours with the new weapon, and even after the training was finished, Vaina had to return to the city wall to continue his old, boring job. One of the men from Vaina's dormitory had signed up for the flintlock squad, and now he had a brand new flintlock and stood behind him to show off the weapon. If it was not for the rules that forbidden fighting, Vayner would have already made him shut up. But he also noticed something was not right. Didn't my compatriots join the Flintlock squad only a few days ago? Yet, they were allowed to directly start their shooting training through fighting against the demonic beasts. But what about our artillery squad? We aren't even authorized to shoot a shell. Moreover, the cannons are so heavy that it's actually impossible to transport them onto the city wall, thought Vayner. When he looked at the top of the wall, he could see that the wall walk was almost full with people standing side by side in pairs. Usually, everyone was used to running on the inside of the wall walk. Even if it was steep, it was still better than interfering with teammates' fighting movements. As for the cannons, the two wheels alone were wider than the whole wall walk, and using a cannon to shoot downwards did not seem very practical. Could it be that the cannon would not be used to fight against the demonic beasts? The next exercise further confirmed his suspicions. Iron Axe brought the 4 artillery teams to the river. There, Vayner discovered that, without realizing when it had happened, a huge boat appeared in the Redwater River. No, he was not even sure if it was correct to call it a boat. The shell seemed to be made out of the same grey stone that was used to build the wall, and its dimension was very wide but short. Other than 2 bare masts, there was actually no other similarity with a boat. This even caused a heated argument between his team. This is clearly a floating bridge. The first one who came up with a conclusion was Job, who previously belonged to the team with the sailing ships transporting the ore to Long Song stronghold, and he always thought of himself very well informed. They built the deck so wide to make it more stable. During my traveling all over the realm, I've seen many of them, and if this is a boat, then how can it be moved without the wind? After the former wooden bridge of over a decade old in Long Song stronghold was washed away by a flood, people in Long Song stronghold replaced it with a floating bridge. They just placed several of broad planks side by side on a boat and connected them with an iron chain to make it more stable. The furthest place you have traveled to is Long Song stronghold, and yet you call yourself knowledgeable. Rodney sneered. If this is a floating bridge, why would it have 2 sticks? Wouldn't they be blown away by the wind? And look towards the end, don't you see the steering wheel? Floating bridges don't need this. Nelson directly broke in to help Rodney. These 2 brothers were always at the same side. In addition, looking at the construction between the 2 sticks, it looks like a cabin, and it's just not finished yet. This is a boat, no doubt. Vayner was not interested in the boat. He was only concerned about the next training's content. Luckily, he soon found out. Iron Axe asked them to drive the horses that dragged the cannon towards the little town. Yes, that was the boat's name, personally named by His Highness the Prince. After listening to Iron Axe's introduction, Jop's face suddenly became stiff, while the 2 brothers showed a triumphant expression instead, and then they began to tie the wheels of the cannon cart onto the deck of the boat. On the deck, there were 2 groups of stopping poles, each group consisting of 4 poles. They were located in the middle of the deck, one behind the other. This apparently indicated that the deck could fit 2 cannons. Well, with this, Vayner could confirm that they would not be dealing with the demonic beasts. The Redwater River flowed from the north to the south, and there was no large river in the misty forest. When they embarked for the first time, Vayner immediately felt the outstanding stability of the boat. As the river was flowing beneath it, the boat remained motionless. It felt just like standing on solid ground. Only when the horses came on the deck did they feel a little swing. He also noted that every time a team finished their firing practice, Iron Axe would count the time and note it down. Considering that there were only 2 spots for cannons, it was clear that only the 2 fastest teams would get a place on the ship. Vayner secretly told his discovery to the rest of his team, who were immediately inspired and were bursting with energy, and each of them put as much effort as possible into the training. If they were not chosen for the artillery team, they would be sent back to the spear squad. Losing their face was a small matter, and the most important matter was that they would not get a pay rise. Vayner had to wait until the 7th day to finally receive his first live firing training. On that day, His Highness also came to visit the scene, watching the artillery exercise. Everyone in the four groups walked with a broad chest and was full of enthusiasm. Because of their training, everyone was quite familiar with the loading of the ammunition, so it did not take long until the first shot was fired by Vaina's team. It was the first time he saw the power of a cannon. With a deafening roar, the cannonball was shot and landed around 500 meters away in the snow, blasting a lot of snow and mud into the air, and then bounced even further. It was impossible for Vaina's bare eyes to track the iron ball. The scene made Vaina both excited and a bit frightened, wondering how His Highness had managed to make such a terrible weapon. If he had to face an artillery attack, even with a full body armor, it would be to no avail. After a round of firing, His Highness the Prince would order someone to mark the landing position with a flag. And at the same time, he let someone measure the distance between the muzzle and the flag. After 4 rounds came the turn of Vaina's team again. He heard the command to change the cannon angle. A scale, marked with 0, 5, 10, 25, and 30, was placed on the joint of the two ends of the cannon and the cannon mount. Although he did not understand what this meant, as long as they just followed the instructions, everything would be all right. Iron Axe shouted, "Shoot at the angle of 5. Jop, who was the strongest, took the ramrod, inserted it into the muzzle, waiting for Vaina to tighten the screws, and pressed it upwards until the white line was inserted in the hole, and then he let it go. Compared with the angle of the barrel at the beginning, the angle now was a bit lower, and when the cannon was raised, it showed exactly 5 on the scale. What followed next was again 4 rounds of firings, putting flags, measuring the distance, adjusting the angle. Vaina slowly started to understand the reason behind His Highness the Prince's actions. He was recording the distance of every shot, and the higher the angle of the cannon, the further the iron ball would fly. This was something that Vaina could understand from his experience of using a bow. The higher up the aim, the further the arrow would fly. If the arrow was shot horizontally, it would hit the ground very fast. He never thought that this was the case with the cannon too. The flying distance would be so much further because of its bigger velocity. Suddenly, he got this crazy idea: what if the iron ball got faster and faster? Would it be possible that it would never land? Considering that Wendy would act as the boat's driving force, the boat's crew needed to be absolutely reliable. So, Roland picked some people who already knew about the witches as the first crew of the little town. Chief Knight Carter became the captain, the helmsman was Brian, the sailors who had to set the sails were Carter's men, and the task of communication was left to Tiggy-Pine, Nana's father. These people often came into contact with the witches, so coupled with their ideological transformation with which they got rid of their prejudice against the witches, there should not be any problem. In the case of Tiggy-Pine, it was even less the case, since his own beloved daughter was a witch. Chapter 82, The Initial Sail of the Little Town. As the only one professional with sailing experience, Lightning was honored to be the navigator. In fact, she was also very interested in the weirdly shaped, peculiar barge. Although it looked very ugly, it had all of the basic parts that a ship should have. However, she was unsure about whether it would sail. After all, she was mostly just a bystander on the sea, as her father always refused her requests of steering or hoisting the sail. In accordance with the tradition, Lightning smashed a bottle of ale on the bow and ordered to raise the sail for the barge's maiden voyage. Carter, as the commander, surely did not want the little girl to take over the position, and thus, the knight always followed with the same command after her. The sail of the little town was made of animal skin. It was mostly calf leather and sheepskin with a mix of some bordered town specialties, such as wolf skin and bear skin. It looked like a rag, patches mixed with different colors and shading, with brown, white and gray colors. The sail was leader-shaped and was separated by 4 sticks of beams in which the cable passed through the iron ring on the top and fell onto the deck. The entire sail could be raised by simply pulling the cable. Both the sails at the front and the back of the little town were single sail that ran parallel to each other and perpendicular to the center line for easy operation. If the normal brigantine was set in the same way, It would cause one sail very little wind consumption and would almost make it useless. However, the design would enable the power to be evenly distributed on both sides of the central line with Wendy's ability to control the wind, and would be more convenient for the helmsman to operate a direct. Lightning commanded the men on the shore to untie the rope once the sail had completely risen up. The weather was still fine at the time with occasionally falling snow. The boat was slowly leaving the shore, driven by the breeze and water flow. The little girl landed beside Brian and shouted, "Full rudder towards the right." Carter also shouted, "Full rudder towards the right." What do you mean by full rudder to the right?" Brian scratched his head and asked, "How many circles should I steer towards the right?" "No, turn it all the way to the left." Lightning hit her forehead with her hand and said, "Forget it, I'll do it." She forgot that it was the first time for the crew to operate a two-masted sailing ship. They did not even understand basic commands. The sails of a standard brigantine would not have unfurled so quickly. The design of the little town was indeed so unique that the cement boat had smoothly left the shore with less than a 10-man crew. She held on to the steering wheel, which was taller than she was, and lifting her feet off of the floor, she rotated it towards the left. The huge steering wheel was very heavy for an ordinary woman. It was hard overcoming the water resistance in order to direct the iron rudder at the bottom of the boat in the absence of mechanical assistance. However, all these were not a problem at all for Lightning, who could fly. She noticed the block that was set to prevent the turnaround at the bottom of the steering and wondered, "I heard that this ship was designed by His Highness, Prince Roland himself. How come he could be so clear about all these little details? Even experienced sailors who were out on the sea all the time may not know how to design a ship." "Sister Wendy, the wind." Wendy was amused, standing on top of the roof. She suddenly felt a subtle sense of contrast, thinking of her usual chores like drying the meat and clothes. She opened her arms to get into the state of her usual practice. She let the wind evenly blow beneath her feet and over her head in order to make sure both sails received equal wind resistance. Honestly, Wendy did not expect the seemingly simple request to be so difficult. Although she had awakened as a witch 15 years ago, she had never tried to understand and control her strength thoroughly. Both summoning a swift current that wrapped around the rocks to attack the enemy or summoning a storm to wipe out the enemy required her to release a huge amount of magic power at once. While dealing with the chores in the campsite did not require the wind power to be constant as long as it achieved the purpose. Wendy suddenly felt ashamed of herself while thinking back to Anna's serious look during the practice. The first thing you have to do is to practice your ability repeatedly until you can completely master it. Just like Anna. It turned out that the prince meant it when he said so. She took a deep breath and concentrated all of her attention on sensing the wind. Although the wind was not completely balanced, the sail was still bulging up and the continuous thrust had caused the mast to make a squeaking noise. The bow started to swing rightwards. "It's really moving," Carter exclaimed. "His Highness made a cement boat that floats on above the water," Taghi smiled and said while touching his stubble. "Is there anything he can't do?" The little town was going further and further away from the shore and gradually moving into the center of the river. Wendy could create wind from nothingness, but she could not make the existing north wind disappear. The ship was not sailing forward in a straight line due to the effect of both winds. It needed to rely on the steering wheel to adjust accordingly. Brian could only experience it personally as Lightning was not able to clearly state the point. In order to let Brian master this feeling as soon as possible, the little girl had commanded him to implement a few big changes of steering direction to feel the relationship between the turning angle of the steering wheel and the swinging amplitude of the bow before making further little adjustments. Wendy was the first to be worn out after sailing on the Redwater River for over an hour. It was not because of the exhaustion of magic power but that her body had hit the limit. Although her body was wrapped up like a dumpling, she still could not resist the cold wind. There was a thin layer of snow gathered on top of her cotton-padded cap, and her frozen hands and feet were almost numb. Her body was shaking unsteadily on the platform. She would probably persist until she passed out if Lightning did not notice anything unusual when she was patrolling in the air. Lightning quickly flew beside Wendy and tightly held onto her body while shouting for Brian to pull into shore. Brian steered the helm to the right and the bow deviated to the left. Lightning flew down with Wendy. Although she could only stir a sail from the deck, at least she could temporarily avoid the cold and prevent the excessive loss of body temperature. As pulling into the shore required fine controlling, Lightning did not dare to entrust it to be operated by someone who just learned to steer, although she was not very experienced herself either. The little town finally landed after tossing around for a while. Everyone's heart was raised when it collided with the riverbank. The hull made a dull noise when hitting the land, but fortunately, it looked just fine. The men quickly gathered the sail and put the springboard up to the shore. Luckily they did not choose a straight path for the trial but instead chose to practice, sailing back and forth in the spacious area of the riverway. Thus, the little town was not too far off from the dock of departure. Lightning flew straight towards the castle with Wendy at her back. Carter looked at the stone boat and sighed as it was not possible to sail the boat back to the dock themselves without the witch's help. Chapter 83, The Cart Driver from the Northern Region. Winter was not a harvesting season for most people in the northern region, especially in the town around Hermes Highlands. The months of demons did not only bring the non-stop rain and snow but also severe cold, hunger, and death. However, it was different for False Leg White. The emissary of the church would look for him every winter and get him to drive up to the kingdom of Wolfheart for a trip to fetch the suffering orphans to Holy City with his carriage. It was a good deal for him, for he could make around 20 silver royals per trip and it was a good deed. The months of demons this year was almost ending and this trip should be his last one for the year. "My lord, why don't you stay in the carriage? The snow out here will continue for a while. We're accustomed to the wind and the snow, but you'll be freezing." "This is nothing to me." The emissary took a gulp of wine from his flagon and said, "It's much colder in New Holy City than here. The leather clothing and armor won't keep out the cold on the highlands. They're like a pervasive demon, piercing through each part of the body. Normal human beings may not survive that place without the cold expelling pill." "That's true." White continuously nodded. He had not been to New Holy City, nor did he want to. However, as an experienced cart driver, he could always find a new topic to talk about. Plus, the current emissary was friendlier than the previous emissary. "Your gloves are specially made with the wolf skin from the kingdom of Greycastle in the western region, I suppose?" "Oh? How do you know that?" "Hey, I've been working as a cart driver for almost 30 years, my lord," White proudly said. "I started driving for the Baron, followed by the Countess, and even the little princess of Kingdom of Wolfheart. If I did not break my leg in an accident, I would probably still be staying in the house of the Earl. They have nothing more than the gold royals, the leather and silverware of the Kingdom of Greycastle, the jewelry of the Kingdom of Everwinter, the artwork of the fjords were the topics they couldn't stop talking about once they were aboard, and I almost get sick of them." "I see." The emissary nodded and said, "Was that where your nickname came from? What kind of accident was it?" "It was the riot of refugees. The bullies would do anything for a living," White spat and said. "They had surrounded the carriage at that time, and I had to urge the horse to escape in order to protect the Countess. As a result, the startled horse threw me off and the carriage was overturned." "So, you broke your leg?" The emissary curiously asked. "What about the Countess?" "She was much better than I was. There were cushions and thick quilts in the carriage, so she was just badly bruised," White angrily said. "She climbed out from the carriage and ran away, leaving me alone on the road. I crawled home with my broken leg and spent all my savings on a fake leg." He knocked on the copper stick that was sticking out of one of his trousers and said, "However, the house of the Earl kicked me out with the excuse that I wouldn't be able to drive a cart anymore. The damn nobles. What a pity." The emissary paused and said, "However, gods didn't abandon you, and you're now driving for the church." "Praise God." "Indeed, my lord. Praise God." While saying so, White thought to himself, "No. If God is really kind, I shouldn't have experienced such a tragedy. God didn't save me when I needed him the most." Right then, they heard a girl crying inside the carriage. "Stop for a moment," the emissary ordered. White pulled the rein tightly to make both of the horses stop gradually. The emissary hopped off the carriage and walked around to the back of the carriage. Soon, the sound of whipping was heard from the carriage. "Poor child," he sighed. "Just bear it, he's your savior. You won't even survive the winter and probably become an unattended dead body along the street without Lord Emissary." The emissary returned and climbed back up to the shafts after a while and said, "Let's go, sit tight. Drive." White shook the reins and the cart started moving again. "They're all from the kingdom of Wolfheart?" "More or less. The churches from each of the town in the kingdom would take in some orphans. The number of people we take in will increase by a few times, especially during the winter when there's a shortage of food and clothing. It would not be sufficient depending only the friars from the churches, so they have entrusted the cart dealer to hire some trustworthy driver to assist in delivery." "You've done a very good job, White. My previous colleague has highly recommended you." "It's my pleasure to be able to participate in such good deeds," White said with a grin. "My lord, are they all being sent to the cloister?" "Forgive me, although they're all orphans, they have very different characteristics. Even though some of them are still young, they would have done almost anything." "Won't they stay in Holy Land?" "God will judge them. Although they're guilty, they'll be given a chance to redeem themselves." "Is that so? That's a good thing." White looked up to the sky. "It's late, my lord. Do we need to spend the night in the next town? If the weather is good tomorrow, we'll arrive the old holy city by noon." The emissary yawned and said, "Let's find a hotel with a yard to park the carriage. You may go to prepare food for them." "Okay," White answered. The town was the only way to the old holy city from the kingdom of Wolfheart, and it was not his first time here. He was so familiar with the places here that he quickly found the hotel which he used to stay. After he parked the horse cart at the yard, he went to buy some food for the orphans with the money the emissary had handed to him. As usual, sweet potato porridge was the most suitable choice as it was cheap and delicious. After he watched them distributing the porridge, he limped back to the hotel, ordered himself a loaf of butter bun, and started eating while sitting at the bar. As for the emissary, he must have gone to a better place. If it was 10 years ago when his leg was good, he would have gone to the tavern to drink some wine and find someone to play a few dices with. He was pretty lucky back then. As for now, he thought it was better for him to go back to his room and have an early rest when he touched his purse in his clothes. In the evening, he heard some noises in the yard. He woke up and opened the curtain to take a look. White saw the drunk emissary unlock the carriage and went in. After a while, he came out with 2 orphans, and there were 2 men standing behind him, who looked like the nobles from the way they dressed. White drew the curtain and went back to his warm bed. This was not the first time he witnessed it, and the previous emissary always did the same. He thought, comparing to the temporary pain, tolerating is the only way. When you arrive in Holy City, you'll have a brand new life. At least, there won't be worries of starvation and cold in the cloister. White yawned and fell asleep. As soon as the sun rose, he was moving forward with the emissary. It was a smooth journey and they had reached the old holy city an hour earlier than the time they predicted. There was already a church carriage waiting for them, and it looked like the poor kids still had a long journey to go. But it had nothing to do with White. "This is your payment." The emissary threw him a sack. White poured the money out onto his palm after he caught the sack and counted them twice, and it was indeed 20 silver royals. He nodded and said while bowing, "I'll see you next year." The emissary did not answer but waved him away. White noticed that there were a few other carriages that did the same job. He thought, however, something is strange. They're all little girls who came out from the carriage. The church only adopts girls? He shook his head and left behind these questions, and drove back home. Chapter 84, Hermes' Underground Castle. Archbishop Maine stepped across the annular stairs and walked down towards the underground. The staircase, with a depth of at least 4 times that of the cathedral's highest tower and a diameter of about 20 feet, was built in a natural dolmen and led directly into a strategically positioned and spacious castle. The beginning of the staircase was well lit by skylight pathing through the windows of the high dome above, giving the twisting and turning stone walls an icy color. As the archbishop descended, the speckles darkened and merged with the stone surface. Yet the center of the sinkhole reflected a faint blue light. The deeper it went, the brighter the light grew. Even if one was without a torch, there would be no difficulty in seeing things. The stairs were like a little snake that wound around the sinkhole and snuggled up to the stone surface. The stair pavements were granite and were cut rectangular in shape and were around 4 centimeters thick. The width was enough for 3 people to walk on side by side. One side of a stair was deeply embedded into the stone surface, while the other side stretched into the thin air. For safety, there were wooden handrails that were connected with cords on the other side. He had not counted how many stairs there were, but he knew for certain that every slate was laid with tremendous effort. The masons in the church were suspended on ropes so that they could chisel deep enough grooves and embed the slates in them one by one. Every movement had to be made with care. More than 300 people had died from merely their ropes breaking or slipping. If the Hermes Cathedral above symbolized the unyielding spirit of the church, then the underground castle deeply hidden in the sinkhole served as the real core of the church. On the stone surface directly above the stairs, God's stone of retaliation glistened. Every 100 stairs there was a guard from the judgment army. Within the castle, a platoon of God's punishment army was ready to meet the invaders head-on. In the mezzanine between the dome of the castle and the floor of the cathedral, there were numberless sandbags and crushed stones. In the case that Holy City was lost and everyone had to leave, the Pope would start the trap and bury this place in gravel and crushed stones. It was not the first time for Maine to go to the Hermes underground castle, but walking in the thin air still made him dizzy, especially when he looked out from the handrail. He felt as if he were falling. He only calmed down a little when his feet were on the solid ground again. At the bottom of the sinkhole there lay a gigantic round white wet slate whose surface was as smooth as a glass. One could easily see their own reflections in it. With the genius design of the craftsman, this wet slate could reflect the light from the dome that converged on it from the surface. The bottom of the sinkhole was not pitch dark even if there was no torch. At the bottom of the sinkhole one could find that the sunlight was not colorless. The wet slate reflected faint blue light which illuminated the whole sinkhole in a cool shade. With a closer look one could notice that there was an infinite number of dust particles swirling in the brighter spots, as if they were the tiny beings recorded in ancient books. The church used the natural openings at the bottom of the sinkhole along with the rock surfaces and connected them further to create Hermes' underground castle. And thanks to the openings that led in all directions, the air was never stale. As soon as Maine stepped into the gate of the castle, the guardian force became intense. A group of 5 Judgment Army soldiers guarded every barrier. They were all the most loyal warriors of the church. As long as they accepted this duty, each one of them would spend the rest of their life in the castle, not being able to return to above ground anymore. In fact, only he and the Pope could enter and leave the castle freely. Archbishop Heather and Archbishop Typhon were not even able to step into this place. But Maine did not know how many forks of road there were in the castle himself. Except for this main road on the south, there were many narrower roads on the sides. If one walked along one, there would be more forks in the road afterwards. Some of the roads were used by the church, while the others were sealed up. He had heard that when the castle was built, a few craftsmen lost their way in the unmarked forks and never found their way back. The straight main road led to the depths of the mountain. There was a barrier every 100 meters. Maine knew that every district between 2 barriers served a different function. The outermost district was a living quarter for the warriors who guarded the underground. The second district was the home of the archive for documents, manuscripts, and where the surviving volumes of ancient books were located. The third district was the prison, which kept prisoners who could not be seen and the innocent. When he walked past the third barrier, Maine stopped. If he walked further, He would reach the pivotal secret area of the castle, from which all the discoveries and inventions of the church originated. He had only been there once since he became the archbishop 3 years ago, and he could not take the liberty to go there without the permission of the Pope. Maine turned left from the main road into a narrow lane. The lane was short. Before soon he reached its end. The guard at the door soon saluted him, saying, "My lord." Maine nodded. "Open the door." There was a corridor inside the door. On the walls, burning rosin torches were hung like infinite leaping light spots in the dark that stretched to the end of the corridor. At the sides there were numerous thick wooden doors with a number plate hung on each door. The judgment warrior held up the torch and led the way, while Maine paid his attention to the change of numbers. When he saw the number plate with 35 on it, he stopped and opened the door with a key. The door emitted a piercing sound in the silent hole bottom, and the sound continued to echo in the empty corridor. Behind many doors came the cries for help, from both men and women. If one listened more closely, the content was mostly bitter entreaties like, "Let me out. Save me or please kill me." Maine was not moved at all. He ordered the warrior to guard the door, walked into the room and closed the door himself, shutting out the noise. Behind the bars, the archbishop saw an old man sitting on his bed. Maybe he was not so advanced in age, but his hair was grizzled and his forehead was covered with wrinkles. He might not have shaven for a long time, for his beard was long enough to reach his neck. His skin was astoundingly white and his limbs were thin and shriveled like dried branches. Maine took a look at the food box beside the bars, in which the food remained untouched. He sighed and said, "You should have been kinder to yourself. The church isn't short of food. Your meals are prepared according to the standard of a king, except that there's no wine. Even the fish is the best cod from the port of Clearwater. You should be familiar with its taste, shouldn't you, Your Majesty Wimbledon?" Chapter 85, The Road of Thorns. The old man did not react until a few moments later. He lifted his quilt slowly, moved to the edge of the bed, and looked the archbishop in the eye. "If you were locked up in this goddamned place, could you eat anything?" When he spoke, his voice was obscured, as if his throat was tight. "Half a year has passed, and I've been locked here for half a year, without a word from the outside. How are my sons? What about my daughters?" May noticed that there were dints all over the wall, which seemed to have been scratched with nails. Did the old man count the days this way? He pulled a chair in front of the king. "Do you have to ask about these unpleasant things?" The other party remained silent for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm of no use anymore. Are you coming to finish me off?" "Yes." "Then as a dying man, I care nothing about my pleasure or displeasure. I only want to know how they're before I die." As Wimbledon was finishing this last phrase, his words almost transformed into a wail. Maine thought. The old man had shown his dignity and honor as a king. He had tried many times to escape on the way to Hermes after he had been replaced by the believer. He had not gone insane, and instead, he had tried to free himself by negotiating. He did not curse or howl hysterically, which was rare in the castle prison. If it were not for the unchangeable plan, Maine would not have wanted to end such a life in this way. He came up with the idea in the back of his mind that he could tell the old man what he wanted to know. Otherwise, an order for a soldier in Judgment Army to end the king's life for him would suffice. "Your oldest son, Gerald Wimbledon, has died," Maine said slowly. "He was sentenced to beheading by your second son Timothy Wimbledon in the name of treason and murder of the king. Your daughter Garcia Wimbledon has declared independence in the Southern Territory and given herself the title, Queen of Clearwater. A war between her and Timothy is unavoidable. As for your youngest son and daughter, we have no news. Maybe they're still alive." "What did you say? Treason? Independence? What have you done?" "Royal decree on the selection of Crown Prince." He pronounced every single word of the phrase clearly. "We assigned your children to different places and declared that the one who ruled best would be the next king or queen." Wimbledon closed his eyes in pain. After a long pause, he asked in a low voice, "Why? You grabbed the chance on the day of prayer, taking me into a chamber and stripping off my clothes in God's stone of retaliation. You made a witch replace me with some other person. You could have taken charge of this kingdom slowly and built a church in every town. Why did you have to issue something like the so-called royal decree on a selection of crown prince? I couldn't have. Akem. Wimbledon had stirred himself up so much that he curled into a ball, coughing violently. Maine complimented the sentence in his mind for the king. Maybe you would not, but your children may not act as you wish. As they're getting older, they each have their own mind. For example, your oldest daughter, Garcia, seized Port of Clearwater 5 years ago. Even without the royal decree, or if you were to die a natural death, would she watch Gerald ascend the throne without doing anything? The most important fact is we don't have time to do it slowly. You may have noticed a witch's power can't last forever. Damn. What's the benefit for the church if they fight each other? The church will also be engulfed in the flames of war while the believers will die in battles. The whole kingdom will be in chaos. Wimbledon suddenly paused and raised his head in disbelief. Do you intend to? A more violent cough interrupted the king's words. When he recovered his voice, the voice became so soft, as if the fit of coughing had drained all the energy from him. You want to eliminate the royal family? Exactly. But to put it more precisely, it's the kingship that we'd like to eliminate. Maine could not help but be amazed by the acute judgment of the king. The number of people who had stayed in a dark cell for almost half a year and retained their clarity of mind could be counted on a single hand. Kingship hinders the development of the church. No matter how weak the kingship is, it'll grow like a sapling. The only way to get the kingdom for real is to root it out. Wimbledon's face looked much older now. He may have seemed aged before, but now his spirit was broken too. His eyes were dimmed. The kingdom of Greycastle is the largest kingdom and has the strongest army on the continent. A war against it would be unfavorable for the church. We've planned so long for this. Your kingdom will lose countless soldiers and mercenaries in the civil war. In 2 or 3 years, our Judgment Army will be able to take over the whole territory of Greycastle easily. You don't have to grieve so much, for you'll not be the only king who loses his kingdom. It'll be the same for the other 3 kingdoms. After that, there'll be no difference between the 4 kingdoms. Kingdom of Dawn, Kingdom of Wolfheart, Kingdom of Everwinter, as well as Kingdom of Greycastle will all vanish. There'll be only one sovereign in the vast land. That's to say, the church. Wimbledon was silent. The man who had taken the crown from his brother by force had lost his spirit. Maine even felt a little sympathy for him, though he did not feel the slightest regret in his heart. The church had paid a great price for this. Countless remarkable believers had been willing to sacrifice and serve as pawns in this carefully schemed chess game. The man who had played King Wimbledon III was actually a pious Chief Justice in the Judgment Army. His faith and loyalty to the church were undisputable. He could have gone through the incarnation ceremony of God's punishment army. But for the sake of the mission, he was given the king's image by the witch and died an honorless death in the chamber room in the king's city of Greycastle. He could have had his name carved out on the monuments of Hermes Cathedral. Yet now the church could only bury his name forever. Maine did not expect Wimbledon would speak and took out a small porcelain bottle to make the old man drink its contents. But the king suddenly spoke. Curse. Huh? I curse you. I'll wait for you in the abyss of hell. His voice grew weaker and weaker. Maine could only hear what the king said when he concentrated. Sorry. There's no hell in this world. If there's one, it doesn't belong to us. What we've done is for survival only. Only by uniting the forces of all the 4 kingdoms can the church generate the utmost power to defeat the real enemy. Otherwise. The archbishop stopped because he had seen Wimbledon's hands fall down powerlessly. His head turned to one side, and the movements of his chest died down. He thought. Maine put the porcelain bottle back into his pocket and left. When he pushed the wooden door open, the corridor was quiet, as if the wailing had never been there. He said a few things about the ensuing arrangements to the warrior of the Judgment Army at the door and walked out of the castle with determination. Chapter 86, The Choice of the Witches. Leaf did not know how she managed to get through these days. It took her nearly half a month to return to the camp in the impassable mountain range from the barbarian region. In order to avoid the demonic beasts, she had to carefully hide between sturdy tree trunks and confirm there were no demonic beasts before running to the next hiding place. Though her heart was burning with anxiety, she had no other choice but to march slowly in this way. Once she was detected by the demonic hybrids, she would not be able to escape by herself. More than a dozen sisters had been ruthlessly killed by the demon. The other sisters, who belonged to non-combat type, fled in all directions when the demon Ironhand jumped into the crowd and began his massacre. But Leaf did not know how many of them were able to survive and return to the camp. She dared not to even think about it at all. As she always had to hide herself during her journey, she consumed her magic power quite quickly and was only able to walk about a dozen miles every day. In addition, she had to save some magic power to survive the night. Since she ate up all the food she brought, she had to transform some wild fruits to make them edible. The emblem of Witch Cooperation Association had run out of power and stopped to give warmth, so she had to wrap herself up with barks. Thinking of young Sheena who died before her maturity, Leaf could not stop her tears from falling. What's worse, on the evening of the fourth night, she suffered the demonic torture in a trunk. She completely forgot about it after the continuous attacks these days. A terrible pain quickly spread from her chest to her whole body, as if she were being torn apart. For an instant, she nearly became unconscious, and she had to bite her tongue hard to resist the pain. Under the constant torture, Leaf thought of giving up several times. However, she thought about the 20 sisters who might still be alive, or be waiting for her at the camp. She also thought about those that were seriously wounded and could only be cured by her. All of these made her grit her teeth and persevere on. Luckily, the demonic torture did not last long this time. When she finally struggled from the torture, she found there were bleeding cracks all over her body, and her blood had wetted the trunk. Afraid that the smell of blood would attract the demonic beasts, she had to take off her clothes and rush to hide in another tree despite the pain and fatigue. At the same time, she made green leaves grow on a bare branch with her magic power and made clothes out of leaves to keep warm. With the magic power, the branch became her needle while the leaf veins were her threads. On her way back to the camp, she did not get to eat any cooked food or drink any warm water. When she entered the impassable mountain range, even though she added 2 more layers of green leaf clothes and tightly wrapped her hands and feet up, her toes still suffered frostbite. This was due to the rapidly falling temperature and the heavy snow that went up to her ankles. She walked and paused all the way, dragging her feet which could not feel anything, and finally arrived at the camp. When she saw the familiar figures of the sisters, she fell head down and fainted. When she woke up, it was already 2 days later. Having been exposed to low temperature for a long time, her feet were too severely injured to be healed by herbal medicine. The sisters had no choice but to cut off 2 necrotic toes from each of her feet to stop the spreading of gangrene. Leaf did not care much about it. She was lucky enough to be alive, compared with those sisters who could never return. But seeing the white bandages on the arms of those wounded sisters, she could not help but feel extremely sorrowful. When they started off, there were 42 sisters, but now, only 6 of them survived. The sisters tried to comfort her, and then Scroll, the oldest witch, told her what happened to them after they had fled. When Leaf was fighting the demon, the non-combat type of witches seized the opportunity to escape toward the camp. On that night, they were attacked by the demonic beasts, a group of demonic boars. Unable to resist, they had to flee again. Those sisters chased by the demonic beasts had little chance of survival, but they could do nothing about it. The next morning, under the attack of another demonic hybrid wolf, only 8 witches escaped successfully. Fortunately, when they entered the impassable mountain, the beast finally left. A few days after they returned to the camp, 2 sisters began to suffer the bite of the magic power. Maybe because of the terrible experience and the bleak future, neither of them were able to survive. Since none of the combat witches came back, everyone thought that they must have died in the hands of the demon, so no one expected that Leaf would come back. So, Where are the other sisters? Red Light, Windseeker, and respected mentor, what happened to them? Leaf shook her head. I'm the only one who survived. Is that so? Scroll replied softly, having already guessed the answer. Have a good rest, and... She hesitated for a moment, and then she said, Leaf. What? Before you woke up, we had a discussion. In case Kara won't come back, I hope you can take the position of our mentor. Leaf was stunned for a moment and closed her eyes to consider. Well, after these heavy blows, the Witch Cooperation Association would probably fall apart immediately if there was no new mentor. The dream of the association was to seek the Holy Mountain, a place of freedom and peace. But now the dream was broken. No, even Holy Mountain was a lie, as it did not exist in the impassable mountain range, or in the wild places. In this case, should the association still exist? Those thoughts were getting on her nerves. Even without looking at the sisters, she could feel the expectations in their eyes. They needed someone to tell them what to do and to lead them on their journey. Let's go and look for Nightingale, said Leaf, after a long silence. What? Nightingale? You mean we are going to Border Town? What if she lied to us? Wendy is also there. Maybe she's been dead for ages. Hearing what Leaf said, the sisters raised questions eagerly. Scroll clapped her hands to calm them, and then asked Leaf, what if Nightingale also lied? You can wait outside the town, in some safe place. Leaf opened her eyes. Let me go first to find out whether Nightingale was telling the truth. If she lied, I will take over the position of the mentor. But if I die in the town, Scroll, please lead the sisters to seek freedom. But Leaf forced a smile. I know your ability is unsuitable for fighting, and not very helpful for the daily operation of the camp. But now I understand that the strength of the ability is not the most important standard for the position of the mentor. The mentor should be a guide, instead of being the strongest one. Unfortunately, it was too late for her to understand it. If Wendy, who was patient and cautious, was their mentor, would the result be different? You, as well as Wendy, were the first witches to join the association, and also the elder sisters. When we came to the impassable mountain range from the eastern part of the kingdom, you behaved in an experienced manner and were cautious. No one is more qualified than you to become our mentor. Scroll fell into silence for a while, and then said, what if Nightingale was telling the truth? Then the Witch Cooperation Association should not exist anymore. Leaf slowly said, Border Town will be our new holy mountain. Chapter 87, The Winter Twilight Part 1. Ready. Stab. Vayner exerted himself to stab forward with his spear. Holding it with both hands, he could feel the violent tremble and hear the crackling of the spear. At the end of the spear was a demonic wolf. That beast had fluffy fur and blood-red eyes bulging like bells. In its wide-open mouth were 2 rows of fangs, and the largest one was as big as his thumb. This was his first time to face a demonic beast so closely. It was trying to attack him with its claws and the snowflakes were spattered all over on his face. Vayner felt his mind was a blank. He was only driven by his instincts learned during the training, while subconsciously holding tightly the shaft of his spear and continuing to attack. Time seemed to flow slowly, and the shaft was bent to its maximum. The spear was stabbed deeply into the belly of the wolf, and he even thought that the sharp claws would tear his cheeks open in the next moment. Bang! Unable to withstand the force of the wolf any longer, the shaft finally broke into 2 pieces. The sound also made time flow normally again, as he could saw the wolf falling down, just like it jumped on the wall earlier on. Its claws failed to clutch the city wall, scraping flakes along the wall, and then smashed on the ground, with half of his spear still in its belly. Flintlock squad, finish loading. Fire. 2 gun barrels immediately stretched out beside Vayner. He hurried to take a half step back and raised his head to avoid the scattered fragments and the smoke of the gunpowder. As for his ears, he had no time to cover them. Soon after the guns fired, Vayner stepped back to the front, where he discovered a variety of demonic beasts dead at the base of the wall. Someone poked him in his back. He turned around and saw his roommate grinning proudly at him. Vayner thought, "You have just got the opportunity to touch the gun for a week. You have nothing to be proud of." He cast a stern glance at him and turned back to look at the battlefield. "When His Highness's cannon platoon is ready, you'll know the gun in your hand is just like a stick. Gunner, here is your spear." Cat's Claw handed Vayner a new wooden spear. "Are these demonic beasts crazy? They've been attacking us for nearly 2 or 3 hours, right?" "They were already crazy," answered Vayner. He took the spear and placed it properly, waiting for the next attack. "What time is it?" It was almost noon. Cat's Claw sighed. When the hunter was not looking at him, he took a quick glance at each side and asked, "Where is Job? And the Rodney brothers? Don't turn around. Do you want to be torn in two by the demonic wolves?" Vayner snapped. They were assigned to the other section of the city walls, maybe in the 3rd or the 4th group. "By the way, why are you in Group 1? "I belong to the auxiliary force." Cat's Claw laughed and said, "Wherever there is a need, I'll come to help. Just now an older soldier was wounded, so it was my turn to." "Ready?" The order of the hunter-observer interrupted Cat's Claw's words. Vayner saw a dozen of demonic beasts rapidly approaching. Now he could also quickly distinguish the types of demonic beasts. He discovered there were only 2 demonic wolves, while the rest were demonic boars, demonic foxes, and a demonic bear, which were no big threat to the city wall. Stab. In spite of that, he still obeyed the order and stabbed forward in unified action with his group members. As expected, his spear stabbed into nothing but thin air. After withdrawing his spear, he saw from the corner of his eyes that the demonic wolves were killed by other soldiers from Group 1. When the slower demonic beasts gathered around the city wall, the flintlock squad squeezed by his side again, shooting downwards. They had repeated these fixed actions from daybreak until the present. When the horn was first sounded, most people were still sleeping. Vayner yawned. This time, the attack of demonic beasts was more intense than ever before. Usually, they just needed to resist 1 or 2 waves of demonic beasts, but today, the corpses of beasts were almost piling up along the wall. They had been replaced by the 2nd militia halfway so that they could have a short rest and a bit to eat, after which they returned to the city wall. Surprisingly, Vayner found that he behaved more calmly than he had imagined. He would withdraw his spear when he heard the order, leaving the rest to the flintlock squad, just as he had practiced in peacetime. Those regulations and actions, which originally seemed to be strange, came in handy and were incredibly effective. Other soldiers behaved just like Vayner, firmly grasping the spear and having a serious look on their faces. Some auxiliary soldiers were very nervous, but still stood upright and no one stepped back. Vayner knew that the daily repetitive training gave them confidence, but the morale was boosted mainly by His Highness. Only after the flintlock squad fired, Vayner would steal a glance at the lookout tower in the middle of the city wall. That was where the prince stood. Since the horn sounded, His Highness immediately came to the city wall and stood there to overlook the battle without any rest. Even when Vayner was replaced to have his meal, he found that the prince remained on top of the lookout tower. Even his breakfast was sent there by the chief knight. Vayner recalled that the last lord would always withdraw by ship as quickly as possible before the beginning of the months of demons. Then the other nobles would also go on board. The civilians would be the last ones to leave. If they could afford some silver oils, they could leave with the ships. But if they had no money, they had to walk to Long Song's stronghold by themselves. Thinking about that, Vayner felt that he was full of energy again. Yes, they belonged to the Grey Castle Prince's militia, totally different from the patrol team of Border Town in the past. With armors and weapons, those members of patrol team often bullied civilians in the New and Old District and blackmailed the foreign businessmen. In Vayner's view, except the 2 captains, the rest of the patrol team were nothing different from rogues. But the militia, led by His Highness, was a strong team, which was able to block the terrifying demonic beasts outside of Border Town, making it impossible for them to advance. In the past, only Long Song's stronghold was able to do this. Just look at Fishball, the famous coward in the old district, who used to be ridiculed by others. Since he joined the 2nd Militia, he was brave enough to fight the demonic beast with his spear. And Fermi, tall in stature but slow in action, was often teased by the people of the old district. But now he was able to fight with his spear in a quick and firm way, and he was even more skilled than the others. Vainer knew that Fermi would always thrust out another 100 slashes after the others had finished their training, just because His Highness once said to him, "Clumsy birds have to start flying early. To be successful, you have to keep one step ahead of everyone else to be able to surpass them." Originally Vainer came here for the 2 eggs, but now he felt lucky that he had joined the militia. Every day there was some subtle change, and every day he made progress. Vainer believed that he was definitely not the only soldier who felt it. He did not know how to describe his feelings. Maybe he could use the words which were often said by His Highness during the training, "You're a team that's out of this world." Hoot, hoot. Vainer suddenly heard 2 short horn blows, which was the warning sign for the demonic hybrid. He looked into the distance and discovered a demonic hybrid with a lion's head and 2 wings, which was similar to that beast which broke into the town last time. This was the 2nd one, he thought. But this time was different. Besides the Flintlock squad, we had more help. Vainer turned around slightly, and from the corner of his eyes, he saw a girl with short blonde hair floating beside the prince. Chapter 88, The Twilight of Winter Part 2. Take it easy. It hasn't come yet. Roland sighed as he watched the eager lightning. God only knew why she was so interested in challenging demonic beasts. Obviously, she was not cut out for battle, but yet she was hardly frightened of the demonic beasts that scared most people. Do it the same way you dealt with the first one. Leave your bravado behind. Your job is to draw the beast's attention and lure it here. Watch the height you fly at in case the beast pounces up to strike you. I know, Lightning said, brimming with confidence. I've learned all the details from the fight against the first beast. Give me some credit. I won't let this one touch me at all. While they were talking, the demonic hybrid beast was approaching the wall. It crossed the obstacle belt and sprung over the city wall towards the unguarded area. This time, the militia members did not respond but stayed where they were deployed, waiting for the instruction from the hunter observers. Now the fight begins against the demonic hybrid beast, Roland said in a deep voice. Lightning, who was already on her way, stopped and looked back at Roland. What's the matter? Roland asked. What you just said was. Lightning thought for a while and shook her head, a little strange. Anyway, forget it. I'm leaving. Watching her fly away, Roland laughed awkwardly and asked Anna and Nightingale behind him, did it sound strange to you both? Yeah. Both of them nodded. Thought Roland. Off you go, and keep safe, Roland said. Same to you, Your Highness. Nightingale bowed and took Anna's hand before walking into the mist. The wind blowing against him, Roland stood with his hands behind his back, endeavoring to cast an impression of a big boss. Knowing that a lot of men watched him secretly during the break of the war, he kept standing firmly on top of the wall, letting everyone see the sign at any time that their prince would always stand with them. Since he could not fight in the war personally, this was the best he could do to inspire his men. The attack of the demonic beasts this year was the strongest on record. According to Iron Axe, in previous years, there had been only 1 or 2 demonic hybrid beasts during the months of demons. This year seemed very unusual as the number of the intruding demonic hybrid beasts was up to 4, and the war lasted longer. The demonic beasts constantly emerged from the misty forest and marched unceasingly towards the town in a pack of 10 or so. Fortunately, last month they had prepared enough flintlocks to arm the flintlock squad of 100 men, otherwise they would not be able to guarantee such an efficient killing speed. If they used crossbow bolts, it would be very hard to keep up the loading speed by now. In a protracted battle, the advantage of the flintlock that cost less labor was standing out. Of course, the high consumption of gunpowder did bother Roland, hence he was planning to unpack all the gunpowder reserves in the warehouse, more than 20 packs of them, to supply the flintlock squad. On the other side, lightning had approached the place above the demonic hybrid beast. She took a stone out of her pocket and cast it to the beast. The stone hit right on its head. The unexpected attack made the beast step back immediately before it saw that the attack was from the sky. Lightning lowered her flying height to challenge the beast and flew by it, keeping close to the ground as she began heading to the center of the town. Though the beast could think, it seemed to the beast that the little flying girl was weak and non-threatening. So it pounced on her immediately, its wings spreading open to strike the air, and with only a few bounces, it glided forward almost 100 meters. Lightning flew higher at once and turned around in the sky, passing by some houses and turning into another street. Through the perplexing paths, she lured the enemy to the square in the center of the town where she would launch an attack on the beast with Nightingale and Anna as they had planned. Since the beast was sensitive enough to discover Nightingale even when she was hiding in the mist, it was critical for Lightning to catch the beast's attention before Nightingale and Anna launched their attack. The trick worked perfectly. Now the beast was clearly furious and mad, and its nature got the better of it. With mouth wide open, it kept leaping up to catch Lightning who, without any burdens, was far agiler. She went up and down to fool the beast and made it miss the target every time it attacked. From the other direction, Nightingale had arrived the square, and unlike Lightning, she walked straight here in the mist where no obstacles like houses and barriers would stand in her way. Anna's fire could reach as far as 5 meters, and in order to lower the chance of the beast cottoning on, they had to be as close as possible. Having learned a lot from the mistake of dealing with the first demonic hybrid beast, now Nightingale was familiar with how Anna attacked. When they were 30 steps away from the beast, she sped up to the limit. Within a split second, the distance seemed to be cut down to 1 step and then they strode over it. It happened so fast that when Anna came to her mind, she found that their face was right by the beast's tail. "Now!" Nightingale shouted. As the white and black world faded away in the blink of an eye, Anna came back to the familiar square. A green fire burst out on her fingertip and enlarged into a fire cage that trapped the entire beast. Nightingale retreated quickly to dodge the heat wave that made her painful. Before the demonic beast could react, the fire that had reached a temperature high enough to melt steel, became a fireball, and finally, the beast crushed. "Looks like they've made it," Wendy, who worked as a guard in Nightingale's absence, curled her lip and said when she saw the green flame far away. "It seems that I didn't have to do much work. I'd hope that none of you step foot onto the battlefield if possible," said Roland in a faux sprightly voice, keeping his posture with his hands behind his back. But he knew in his heart that without the help of the witches, the militia would definitely reel from the demonic hybrid beasts, which were able to fly over the city wall. Even Nana, protected by Baron Tagi, had come to the city wall and was busy healing the wounded soldiers. Roland was very gratified that the first time demonstrating the power of witches in front of the militia had turned out so well. Nana, who was nicknamed Healing Angel, apparently boosted the reputation of the witches to a new level. Moreover, the victory Anna and Nightingale had achieved in the battle against the demonic hybrid beast also earned them cheers among the crowds. He certainly understood that it was impossible for everyone to accept the witches, but as far as he was concerned, the current situation was already an improvement. After the initial interaction between the militia and the witches, his following plan would be carried out more smoothly. All of a sudden, the sound of gunfire became sporadic, and Roland noticed that the beasts were abandoning the city wall. Roland could not believe his eyes. At that moment, a shaft of sunlight burst through the thick clouds, shining on the battlefield, and then a second shaft, the third. Soon the grey sky was riddled with thousands of shafts of light which bled one another to become a single most dazzling one. Suddenly, the land was brightened up. When the sun finally rose up again, it signaled the end of the months of demons. After a short moment of silence on the city wall, the wave of cheers swept across the border defense line. One after another, the townspeople came out of their houses, and following the wave of cheers, they sang and shouted. Cheers for the long-awaited sunshine, cheers for surviving the winter, and cheers for their prince. All the cheers came together, echoing throughout the small border town. Chapter 89, The Celebration Part 1. For Border Town, this year was different from previous years. In the past, after the months of demons ended, the refugees had to wait in the slum of Long Song's stronghold for one more month, until the snow had melted completely, before they could return to their home. What awaited them in Border Town was a mess. The houses that had been unattended for months would be in ruins. Sometimes fragile cabins would collapse from heavy snow. Demonic beasts often lingered in houses. Cabinets and tables had been bitten and broken into parts, and the pallets and rags had been moved to fill in the corners. Apparently, they used these shelters as their lairs. House owners had to spend a week repairing their houses and changing their mildewed furniture. And the rotten stench always lingered in the air. The residents had grown accustomed to it. This year, however, Border Town was renewed. After quickly cleaning the snow, people started to hang colorful paper flags on their doors. These had been granted by His Highness. From afar, with the flags of various colors mixed together, the dull and shabby little town became vibrant, like a sea of flowers. All the people went around spreading the news that on the first day after the end of the months of demons, His Highness would hold a grand celebration party in the square. Everyone was allowed to attend it for free. It was told that there would also be a free meal. A party? In the past, these were only for the noble to attend. Most people simply heard about them from the knowledgeable businessmen who came from big cities. But even the experienced businessmen were not allowed to attend a party, and money could not buy them a ticket. Yet, to everyone's surprise, His Highness was allowing all of them to attend. "Your Highness, I'm afraid this is not a good idea." Chief Knight Carter tried to change his mind. "Without a band or a lead dancer, who'll control the pace of the party? Besides, in a remote place like this, the noble won't even dance. Your subjects will ruin everything." Carter had only been to one party in the capital, which had been held by a marquis for his daughter's birthday. The sounds of elegant strings and passionate drums had interlaced. Ladies had danced to melodious music while men drums, their steps fast and vigorous, and with rotating and tapping they combined the movements and the rhythm of drums. During the break, attendants would serve drinks and desserts among the people. Men looked for lovers, and when the last song was played, they plucked up the courage to ask the object of their admiration for a dance. The one who won a lady's heart would continue his romantic night. Carter sighed. Though he had not won over the admired girl at the time, the elegant, romantic atmosphere of the party still left an impression on his mind. Now the prince intended to replace the graceful noble with peasants who dealt with stones and beasts every day? Goodness, he dared not imagine it. The lead dancers? We have them. Roland had commanded the militia to remove the stone sculpture and gallows in the square. Their iron axe and the militia. The man from Sand Nation? Carter asked in shock. He had accepted Iron Axe, who as the captain of the Flintlock squad, had performed very well during the months of demons, and did not call Iron Axe's foreign title anymore. Yet this did not change what Iron Axe was. How could a man from the Mojan clan understand the manners of the kingdom? Roland laughed secretly. This is not a usual party. You'll understand when you see it. There was not much preparation needed, except removing the obstacles in the square and piling up the firewood in the center for a barbecue. Yes, this was Roland's idea of a celebration party, a bonfire party and outdoor barbecue. Roland had been thinking about how to improve his people's identification with the place they lived. For the uneducated peasants who had spent their whole life serving their lords, the concept of nationalism was too deep to understand. What they really cared about was their properties and families. The further they fell behind, the more short-sighted they were. This was the law of developing civilization. It was written, civilization will eventually become as big as its mind. And Roland could not agree more. However, it did not mean that he should ignore constructing community spirit, and a victory celebration was the best way. He did not understand why there was currently no celebratory party after the end of the months of demons. The invasion of demonic beasts was like an annual natural disaster. There was no doubt that defeating the demons deserved to be written a great deal about. Therefore, he decided to name the first day after the months of demons Victory Day. On that day, all the people in his land would rest, and all kinds of celebrations would be held. Once this celebration was held for 3 or 4 years, it would become a tradition and pass on to future generations. As time went on, his subjects would recognize the difference between themselves and those people who were under other lords' governance. Though it was not yet noon, the square was filled with people. The members of the militia stood in a circle, keeping everyone away from the pile of firewood. It seemed to Roland that free food had a strong appeal to the residents. At least half of the town had attended the party. Everything was perfect, except that the square was a little too small. Apart from the clearing for the firewood, the rest of the square was barely enough to include 1,000 people, who stood nearly shoulder to shoulder and had difficulty moving around. He noticed some children had climbed up to the nearest roof to have a better view of the center of the square. To Roland, it was acceptable for his first celebration party to have some defects. When the time came, he walked on stage to give his speech. This was his second speech in the square, and he was much more composed this time. "Good afternoon, my people. I'm Prince Roland Wimbledon of Kingdom of Grey Castle." He started the same as he had with his last speech, but this time it produced a totally different result. People greeted his opening with enthusiastic cheers. "Long live Prince Roland! Long live your highness!" Roland was touched by the cheers. The spontaneous cheers were from the militia and the crowds, not from the plants like he had arranged during the first speech. A sense of achievement and contentment filled his heart. When the cheers faded, he pressed his hands down to silence the audience. The months of demons have ended. The militia fought hard and bravely to keep the demonic beasts away from the city wall. We've achieved victory in the battle against the fearful enemies at a very low price. It proves that if only we pull together, we could live well, independent from Long Song's stronghold, who intended to threaten us with food and force us to yield to hunger and cold. The victory of today has told them that their schemes have failed and all that they've planned is a futile effort. Exactly. I don't want to go back there anymore. We'll never suffer hunger again if we follow our prince. His Highness has mercy. Finally, we don't have to put up with their extortion. While everyone was in an ebullient mood, Roland continued his speech. Let us celebrate this glorious and honorable triumph. This is a day to remember. I hereby proclaim that from this day forward, the first day after the end of the months of demons will be named Victory Day. This is the reason for our celebration. Enjoy it, my people. Now, let the party begin. A torch was tossed into the pile of firewood that had already been daubed with oil. The fire boomed and soared high, lighting the atmosphere of the whole square instantly. Chapter 90, The Celebration Part 2. 6 marinated cattle were transported next to the bonfire by carts. If they weren't escorted by the militia, Roland suspected that on their way through the crowd, the cattle would have already been cleared by the overzealous masses. This was all of the food reserves the castle had left in the basement. So he would not eat any meat until the arrival of the next merchant ship. The thought of this made Roland cry silently. To organize this celebration successfully, he had used up everything he had. The royal chefs brought over from King's City were only responsible for brushing the meat and controlling the heat. The task of barbecuing was handed over to 6 strong members from the militia. An iron bar was inserted into the cattle's body through its mouth and then placed next to the fire on a brick hearth. The flames were so hot that the heat waves could be felt even at 2 to 3 meters away. Soon the cattle's skin generated a sizzling sound. Oil emerged out of its pores, emitting a succulent scent. Of course, the crowd couldn't be left waiting during the barbecue, so on Roland's signal, Iron Axe led a team of militia to the stage. The extravagant and complicated court dances weren't appropriate for an occasion like this, for there was no time for practice, and they wouldn't even be able to remember all the essential steps, not to mention displaying a perfect dance move. To display a dance that was both enjoyable and easy to understand, The Dance of Sand Nation was clearly a better option for the taste of the civilians. The dance started with Iron Axe and the others placing both of their hands on their waist, and they interlocked each other's arms, creating a chain-like formation, forming 2 rings around the bonfire. Accompanied by the sounds of horns, they began to move clockwise, and with each step, they would kick in the air while shouting "Ha hey." "Is this the lead dance you talked about?" Carter asked in a startle. "Is this even considered as a dance?" "Of course, it is, and it's very easy to remember." The militia members only needed to practice 15 minutes last night to master the steps. Roland answered laughingly, "Would you like to have a try?" Carter shook his head and refused the offer. He felt as if something in his heart broke with a bang. Goodbye, the beautiful girl that melted his heart. Goodbye, the sad memory of youth. The other militia members were clapping with their hands in the rhythm of the dancers' footsteps, accompanied each time with an applause. The extremely dynamic rhythm moved the masses, who, one after another, followed them. As the clapping got faster, the circling speed of Iron Axe and his men became faster as well. Soon the ring began to show signs of coming apart, and it did not take long until one of the dancers accidentally fell, taking down more dancers with him. The crowd was left startled, but the militia members did not stop the clapping, but instead, they clapped more wildly like a rainstorm. Iron Axe helped the men that had fallen down, and asked the crowd loudly, "Do you understand the dance? Anyone wants to try? Every dance will end with members falling down. If you join the dance, you'll get a piece of sweet and delicious honey meat. The longer you dance, the more meat you get." If the noble or the rich families were to invite them, the normal townspeople would never have been involved. Subconsciously, they gave them a feeling that they were superior to them. It was also common for them to go back on their promises. But seeing the militia members, who were their familiar townspeople, waving at them, they were unable to hold themselves back. After the first person soon followed a second and then a third one. A new round of dance started, but this time most of the dancers came from the crowd. Although the dance was simple, everyone was very happy, and plus the reward of the honey meat, the participants tried their hardest to show the best possible performance. This was exactly what Roland wanted to see. Apart from the barbecue, there were also bread, fish cakes, and ale that was distributed to the crowd. The celebration would last until the night, but Roland did not plan to stay all night. He arranged for Carter to be in charge of the security of the town square and the assistant minister to be responsible for the closing speech before he left. He also had a private party to attend at the castle backyard. The backyard was still brightly lit when the night fell. Just like in the town square, there was also a bonfire here. The difference was that the chicken used for the barbecue was cut into pieces. The seasoning and the oil were done by themselves, completely imitating the atmosphere of an outdoor barbecue. The witches fell in love with this kind of novelty of self-service. Of course, in Roland's eyes, this was also a rare spectacle. For example, Anna directly wrapped the chicken into her green flame after seasoning it, which would soon give off a delicious scent. As for Nightingale, she showed off her incredible knife skills. The knife in her hand was flying and dancing on the chicken, causing all of its bones being completely cut off. And of course, there was red wine, brought from Willow Town, and it was much more suitable for the tastes of women than ale. Before Roland could say that minors were prohibited from drinking, Lightning had already emptied half a bottle by herself, and since she was holding the bottle and floating in midair, it would be difficult to stop her, so he gave up the thought. At the halfway through the barbecue, Roland started to feel slightly tipsy. He leaned against the chair, and while watching the group of happy laughing girls, Roland felt very pleased. This was the perfect life for a prince, he thought, and also for the witches. With their extraordinary abilities and appearance, they should not be the object of hunting. If they lived in the world of his previous life, they would have become the dazzling focus where they were. The only thing he could do now was to let them live a normal life here in his territory. At this moment, Lightning flew down, directly landing on Roland's lap, and before he could react, she planted a kiss on his cheek. Although this action was done very quickly, it was still captured by other witches. As Lightning grinningly flew away and saw Anna, Nightingale, and Wendy looked at her in surprise, she waved her hand, explaining, according to the rules of the fjords, during a victory celebration, women can take the initiative to kiss the leader. Dad would always let me kiss him. Is it the same in Grey Castle? Of course not. Roland instantly woke up from his half-drunken state. Ahem, Lightning, you're drunk. Go back to the castle and sleep now. How could I be drunk? Lightning protested. When I was sailing, I often had drinking battles with the crew and I never lost one. Roland could only ask the witches for help, and he turned to Wendy, who nodded and then used her power to softly blow Lightning down. As she was landing, Wendy stepped forward and caught the girl in her arms. Disregarding her struggling, Wendy walked straight to the castle. Don't worry about her, she just drinks too much. Please continue, and soon the dessert will be served. Roland suddenly felt that the atmosphere had turned a little awkward, especially the way Anna was looking at him, which made him feel a chill starting from his feet. The only one who was completely unaffected by what had happened was Nana, and she was still concentrating on her chicken wings like nothing had happened at all. After the bonfire was gradually extinguished, Roland asked Nightingale to escort Nana home. Then he went to the well and washed his face with the cold water, getting ready to go to bed. Roland did not take the former episode seriously. In his view, Lightning was still a little child. But when he arrived at the third floor's bedroom, the prince's heart suddenly leapt. He saw Anna leaning against his door. Chapter 91, The Heart Prison. The moonlight was coming in from the corridor's window, shining on half of the girl's face. Her eyes reflected a faint blue light, looking like two stars in the dark. Anna's body was leaning against the door, with most of her body hidden in the dark, but her silhouette was still visible. Good nutrition had completely changed her previous thin and skinny body, and as a woman who recently became adult, her body was just perfect, containing the right curves of her age and the unique charm of youth. Roland put on a calm face and walked slowly towards her until he was spotted by her. She stood straight and they looked each other right into the eyes. It was just an accident, and I didn't know she would. Roland said. I understand. She's still a child, so I didn't take it serious. I got it too. Anna reacted completely differently than Roland had expected. It did not seem like Anna wanted to argue, and he could not detect any trace of displeasure on her face but only a serious look. There was no emotion within her lake-like blue eyes. Roland realized that she was a straightforward woman, and she neither liked to hide nor she had to hide anything. As expected, she took the initiative and said, I dare not do such a bold thing. In front of so many people, like what Lightning had done, so I have to wait for you here. Upon finishing, her cheeks clearly showed a sign of blush, but even so, she did not shrink back and her eyes remained focused on Roland's. Her expression could not be more serious. Roland's heartbeat gradually slowed down, wanting to say something, but he felt that saying anything right now would be meaningless. Maybe she did mind Lightning's behavior, but complaining was not her style, and she would simply express her own feelings. Honest and hard-working children should not be rejected, he thought. Roland bent down, leant towards Anna's cheek. He could even feel her breath on his face, like a spring breath fiddling his heartstrings. It was so quiet that they could clearly hear each other's nervous breathing in the quiet corridor, and then, a pair of soft lips slightly touched Roland's cheeks. Good night, Your Highness, Anna whispered. Wendy was sitting on the bed and reading some books. For her, times like this were very rare. During her time in the Witch Cooperation Association, she would have never dared to think of having such a life. Not long after she came to town, she developed such a habit. Before going to sleep, she would clean her body, put on a silk gown, which was not fastened around the waist or was it buttoned up, sit cross-legged in the bed, with a soft pillow between her back and the wall, and read the books she had borrowed from His Highness. It had taken her a lot of time until she got Lightning to rest, so she did not plan to return to the castle backyard, and instead, she washed up and went straight to bed. She was now reading a history book about the origin of the church. Although she grew up in a cloister, yet she did not know much about this subject. The nuns had always warned them to obey the teaching of God, but they never mentioned God's name. During her childhood, this discrepancy had always puzzled her. Everyone had a name, so why the highest deities did not have one? What was recorded in the history book was mostly the same with the rumors she had heard. At the beginning, there were 3 major churches, which thought of each other as heretics and believed that their own God was the true one. This battle of faiths lasted for nearly 100 years, and in the end, the church nowadays claimed the final victory. They declared that the heretics had been destroyed, and God has only one name, that was the Word of God itself. The following pages describe the glory and immortality of the Church, including the construction of Old Holy City and New Holy City and their victory over the evil witches. This left Wendy very puzzled. She had previously borrowed the books, The History of the Kingdom of Greycastle and A Brief History of the Mainland from His Highness. The first one almost unequivocally recorded the kingdom's establishment, development, and major events. For example, names of each king, their marital status, and information about their children. The family with all their branches were described in such detail that it almost represented a detailed genealogy. The brief history of the mainland focused more on the evolution of the 4 kingdoms, their alternations in handling their powers, and their political struggles. However, the content still focused a lot on the ruling families. Yet within the history book of the church, there was no mention of any of the popes' names, or could it be that it was the same case with God's name? They just replaced their former names with the title pope. By the first look, it seemed like there was only one pope during all of the hundreds of years of history. This was not logical, and instead of calling it a record, it would be better to call it deliberate delusion. At this moment, Nightingale suddenly appeared within the room. Wendy put down her book and looked at her with interest. "It's been late. You still have time to come here?" Nightingale rubbed her neck and sat beside the bed. "I just finished escorting Nana home." "How is Lightning?" "She immediately fell asleep once I put her in bed, and she wouldn't stop murmuring about her father." Wendy shrugged. "She always acts like she is already a brave big girl, but in truth, she's still a little child." "In your eyes, everyone is still a child," Nightingale replied and took the book from Wendy's hand. "His Highness had said that you shouldn't read at night, especially while sitting in bed. You'll hurt your eyes if the lighting isn't strong enough." "Yes, His Highness did say that." The two of them chatted for a while. They talked about their travel from Silver City to the impassable mountain range, about the time they heard the news that a witch was soon to be killed in town and how the prince fought off the months of demons. Nightingale had a lot to say and Wendy would also occasionally throw in 1 or 2 sentences. During the past 5 years, these two had developed such a great chemistry and understanding between each other. The time passed slowly until finally, the candles were about to extinguish. At that time Wendy began to smile and asked, "So? You can't sleep because of Lightning's actions today? What are you talking about? What else can it be?" Wendy smiled and shook her head. "Veronica, we're witches. You should know better." Nightingale remained silent, and after a long time she replied, "Well, this was fate that no witch could escape from it." Wendy sighed and then said, "Roland Wimbledon is the kingdom's 4th prince, and we have to do everything necessary to ensure that he'll take over the throne of Kingdom of Greycastle. He'll rule the kingdom well and he'll be able to create a place for us sisters to live in. But at that time, he must do what a king needed to do, and when the time comes, he'll have to marry a duke's daughter or the princess of another kingdom in order to give birth to one or many heirs. If it's a boy, he'll inherit the throne, and if it's a girl she'll be married to another noble family." Here, Wendy paused for a moment, and then spoke aloud what Nightingale, or actually what all witches did not want to hear. "Veronica, we're witches, who can't give birth to children. Even by thinking most optimistically, after His Highness has ruled for many years, and our sisters can finally walk in the streets of the kingdom freely. On some occasions, outstanding witches would be able to join the upper ranks of society, and maybe even get canonized as nobles. But the fact that witches can't give birth will never change. and without the ability to bear any descendants, will be unable to continue the family's glory. Thus, the nobles would never consider marrying a witch. We have been given a gift, but at the same time, something was also been taken from us. This is our fate." Then she whispered, "May God be merciful." "I see," she whispered. After Nightingale had finally left, Wendy felt upset. But she was confident that Nightingale would be able to overcome this. After all, she had already overcome so many hardships, and she surely would not stumble on this one. She was sure about it. Chapter 92, The Regrouping of the Platoon. "This is the end of our task, right?" In the square, Cat's Claw cleaned up the burned debris from the bonfire and regretfully said, "I really don't want to go back to the mine to work. To be honest, I kind of miss the months of demons." "Yeah, I don't want to deal with those stones," Jop replied. "The most important thing is the pay is too different from the previous one. Where else can we get work like this in the artillery squad? Where can we get to eat meat every day and have a monthly salary of 15 silver royals?" "What a silly thing to say," said Vaina, who was holding a torch on the side. This time His Royal Highness distributed a lot of grain, so no one starved to death during the months of demons. "Do you remember 2 years ago in the old district, half of the people did not survive the winter? Do you miss that? Anyway, the platoon won't be disbanded. Do you think His Royal Highness recruited us into the artillery squad and burned so much gunpowder, just to hear the bang of the explosion? But there are no more demonic beasts. Why would His Royal Highness still need the artillery squad?" Rodney asked, clutching the broom. "The artillery squad isn't prepared just for the demonic beasts." Vaina pondered but ultimately did not say it. "Anyway, we'll know the answer tomorrow." He yawned and waved his hand impatiently. "Clean this up quickly, I'd like to go back to sleep early." The next day early in the morning, there was an order to gather at the battalion camp, thus confirming Vaina's saying. After all the people were gathered, Iron Axe stood before them and announced, "You have completed the first stage of the task, to protect Bordered Town against the invasion of the demonic beasts. After 3 months and 6 days of fighting, you've received the acknowledgement of His Royal Highness. The militia will be regrouped to form the regular corps of His Royal Highness. If you do not want to continue fighting, you can step out now." His Royal Highness also said, "Those who decide to leave the militia now, will get the full salary and an additional 25 silver royals as." He thought about the words of His Royal Highness. Well, the retirement pension. None of the 300 people moved, only Cat's Claw raised his hand. Report. This was also one of the weird rules developed by His Royal Highness during the training. The platoon members were not allowed to whisper in private. If they wanted to inquire about something, they had to first shout report. Iron Axe nodded. "Speak up. What is the meaning of the regular corps? Does that mean we become knights?" Vaina could not help but laugh, but he soon returned to his serious demeanor. "Knights? But that would already be considered as the nobility. Not only would that include property and squire, but would also include the conferral of land." Asking this type of question was really an embarrassment to the artillery squad. "No," Iron Axe patiently explained. Apparently, he had also asked His Royal Highness before. The regular corps is a full-time platoon, used to protect His Royal Highness and his domain. In other words, while the workers are mining, you're training. When the farmers are harvesting the wheat, you're still training. When the merchants are selling the goods, you would still be training. All the training is in preparation for future victories, just as you did during the months of demons. So how is that different from the militia? Cat's Claw continued asking. More frequent training, a more rigorous system, and a more lucrative return. Report. This time it was Rodney. As soon as Iron Axe nodded, he asked eagerly, "What's the more lucrative return?" Vaina sighed. Why was each of the young men in their team so impetuous? In fact, he would also like to know the answer to this question. The regular corps follow the army system. They complete designated missions during combat, and for those with excellent performance, they can be promoted to officer, Iron Axe said loudly. For example, be promoted to my position." Was this what His Royal Highness said? Vena secretly thought. If this was really carried out, wouldn't this be encouraging everyone to go against their superiors? He quietly looked around, but it seemed others were unaware of this problem and were still listening with relish. Officers can get higher pay, and own land. The last sentence resulted with a burst of voices. Vena was no exception. He even doubted whether he heard the wrong thing. If they could get land as well, then how was that different from a knight? But remember that once you choose to become part of the regular corps, you need to follow a system that's completely different from the militia. Failure to complete tasks, fleeing, mutiny and other violations of discipline, would be severely dealt with. I'm not talking about eating one egg less. The punishments include hard labor and even imprisonment. The positions and rewards that were received would also be withdrawn. Iron Axe paused. It's still not too late now to quit. The crowd was dead quiet, and after Iron Axe silently counted to 10, still no one moved. He could not help but grin. Well then, from today onwards, you have become a regular corps of His Highness Prince Roland Wimbledon. Vena himself thought that was incredible. If it were 3 months ago, hearing about those terrible punishments, he would have slipped away long ago. What was the use of promotion, of land, compared to keeping their own lives? But now, he chose to stay without hesitating much. Compared to breaking North Slope mine stones, or living aimlessly in the old district, Vena preferred to stay here. You have good powers of observation. What's your name? Mr. Vena, keep up the good work. Thinking about the encouragement from His Highness, he once again confirmed his plan. He belonged to the militia. In the future, he would also be a member of the regular corps, and continue to fight for His Highness. Iron Axe soon announced today's first training, field training. At the beginning, Vena disapproved of running as a training method. Even during the months of demons, the training was rarely interrupted. After eating breakfast, depending on the weather conditions, they had to run 2 laps in the town unless it was snowing heavily. According to His Highness, this was conducive to exercising the bones. When defending the city wall, they would be agile and not have stiff hands and feet or be unable to stab the spears. But when the platoon ran out of bordered town, he immediately felt the difference between the two. At this time the wild snow was still far from melting. 3 months of on and off snow now covered the knees. Rather than running, they might as well be climbing. The platoon suddenly became scattered. Once a foot sunk in, it took a lot of effort to pull out. There was no doubt that this type of special training to torment them was His Highness's idea. Vena had already figured out His Highness's ideas. At this point, protesting was basically futile, and the only thing that could be done was to persist until the end. A back-and-forth trip took the whole morning. When the platoon returned to the town, Vena could hardly feel his legs. The snow that seeped into the boots turned into water. Even if standing under the sun, most people would still be trembling from the cold. A huge physical exertion exacerbated this chill, and even Iron Axe felt it was too much. He announced the dissolution of the platoon for noon and postponed lunchtime to 1 hour later. This gave everyone time to change out of their wet shoes and pants. Everyone was pleased that the afternoon training was cancelled. Of course, they did not know that Lightning had been tracking their field training, and this was also the little girl's daily training content, precise control of the magic power of uniform flight. When she reported the information to Roland, the latter did not know whether to cry or to laugh. The total mileage of the platoon in the morning was 4 kilometers. Chapter 93, The Core Framework. A few days after the victory celebration, Roland continued to devote his energy into the great farming project. Sitting in the office, there was a non-stop ticking sound outside the window as if it were raining. It was the sound of melting snow. When he was in the countryside during New Year, he loved crouching on the window and looking at the long ice icicles melting into transparent water droplets and slowly dripping down. At the moment, he did not have time for such leisure. But it was still enjoyable to listen to the voice of the earth recovering while writing a plan. According to previous years of experience, The snow took about a week or so to melt, but a month would still be needed before it was possible to pass through the road between the town and Longsong's stronghold. It was not hard for Roland to imagine what the muddy road would look like without the surface hardening or proper drainage measures. If he could successfully take over Longsong's stronghold, his first action would be to build a hardened road suitable for horse carriages to pass through. But now the priority was to solve the problem of building the core. Without a reliable and powerful army, it would not be possible to defeat Longsong's stronghold core if they had fewer soldiers. Converting the militia into a regular corps was only the first step. The specific preparation, discipline, punishment and reward system was a real headache. Although he played military chess as a child, at this moment he had long forgotten everything. After some deliberation on his part, Roland simply decided to create his own system. Anyway, he was the creator of the new corps, and no one would notice even if he set up an unreasonable system. So the first army of Border Town was created, consisting of corps, division, battalion, platoon and team as the framework. 5 people formed a team, 10 teams a platoon, and 10 platoons a battalion. As for the number of the division and the corps, he would deal with that later. In view of the overall level of combat in this era, as long as there were 2 or 3 battalion forces, it would be enough to defeat the vast majority of opponents in the field. After setting out the most basic framework, Roland let out a long breath. The next rules and regulations would be much simpler. These included obeying the military order, obeying the superior, no escaping, betrayal and other similar clichés. But Roland's first set of discipline was the prohibition of looting and disturbing the peace. Allowing the military to loot as they wished had too many cons, and it would take several years to reverse the damage it would cause for the local people. This was why he insisted on using civilians as military personnel. When the noble responded to the Lord's recruitment, choosing not to loot after defeating the enemy was simply a fairy tale. It would be more appropriate to say the main reason they were willing to follow the Lord was that they could wantonly plunder the opponent's wealth and territory, including the innocent civilians on the domain. As for mercenaries and bandits, that was better left unsaid. They looked sturdy and vicious, but in fact, they were useless at a real battle. Stealing was a big source of their income, so military discipline for this group of people was meaningless. Only an army formed by civilians would not see other civilians as slaves to be slaughtered. Of course, just depending on discipline and punishment was not enough. As time went by, greed would increase with every winning victory. So the reward system had to keep up with the pace, in order to fundamentally eliminate looting and other disciplinary behavior. In order to make the reward tempting enough for the people, Roland decided to release the ultimate weapon, military land as a reward. Whoever made great achievements during battle, could be granted a piece of land. Roland had already thought of the source of land. That would be the reclaimed land between Border Town and Longsong's stronghold. In this era when 90% of the land belonged to the noble, it was considered a generous prize. Once they had titled land, these people would be closely attached to his side. Any person who wanted to overthrow him would meet the most intense resistance from his army. Motivating the people did not rely on words or whips, but real measurable interests. In other words, as long as he could always represent the fundamental interests of the people, his rule would be stable. Unlike traditional fiefs, Roland limited the land from several acres to about a dozen acres. It could be used for self-built residences, to purchase slaves or hired farmers to take care of the land, but not to build industry. In contrast, a knight's domain was close to 2,000 acres, equivalent to a small village. The industrial income of the above operation could provide the necessary operations for knights and attendants, such as the purchase of weapons, armor, and horses. Such a small area of land reward would not cause a strong conflict between the noble interest groups, and yet it weakened the independence of the recipients. In Roland's opinion, it was similar to a retirement pension, and you could ensure that soldiers still had a stable income after retirement. At the same time, in order to strengthen the centralization of authority, and to avoid the situation that the servant's servant was not my servant, the person who was conferred the land had ownership but no autonomy. In other words, this land was still under the Lord's laws, regulations, and systems. In a sense, they were more like the future generations of farm owners. After transcribing these preliminary ideas, Roland stretched out. Next, he could finally devote himself to his field of expertise, R&D weapons. Since the speed of flintlock manufacturing was increasing, continuing to equip the riflemen to protect the flintlock shooters would be a waste of manpower. The latter needed to have the ability to fight independently in close combat. The solution was simple, that was to install bayonets on the guns. Roland did not expect his troops to take the initiative to start a hand-to-hand combat, but just as the opponents were trying to escape and the cannon could not completely destroy the enemy's courage, they would at least have the strength for battle. A bayonet was not difficult to manufacture. It was simply a sharp cone. The key was the connection between the bayonet and the gun. The original bayonet was the knife handle wrapped around thin wood. The wood could be directly inserted into the barrel. The advantage was it was simple to create, while the disadvantage was also pretty obvious. During the hand-to-hand combat, the barrels would be unavailable, and pulling the bayonet out after the fighting was also particularly laborious. Roland was planning to produce the second-generation bayonet, the casing bayonet. The end of the shank had a corner and was connected to a casing. The casing diameter, which was slightly larger than the barrel, was attached to the Z-shaped tongue and groove joint. The barrel only needed to be welded with a small iron bar, so that the tongue and groove joint could be embedded in to fix the blade. The blade was a triangular iron, its cross-section similar to a V-shape. With all three sides of the blade piercing the body, this did not affect the pulling out, yet leaving a wound that was difficult to heal. The casing bayonet after installation was slightly higher than the gun, and this had a certain impact on filling the ammunition. But compared to the folding bayonet, it was easier to facilitate mass production. All it needed was a sample that could be replicated by the blacksmith. To make the bayonet play a role in combat, the key was to train the soldiers on how to use it. Roland knew nothing about it. Fortunately, he remembered Chief Knight used to boast that he could use any military weapon. He might as well be in charge of teaching the Flintlock Squad on how to fight with a bayonet. Chapter 94, No Reason for the Demolition. The production of cannon was steadily progressing. The second cannon was undergoing a period of chamber expansion, while the third cannon was stockpiling the materials. They would have 4 12-pound cannons a month later if they were lucky enough. It was without question that they held an unprecedented superiority in firepower. But, what Roland concerned about that was how to ensure that the advantage would turn into a victory. As a mechanical engineer, before finding himself in this era, his understandings of war, like most people, was from history, movies, and games. If it was just hand-to-hand combat, he would give Carter and Iron Axe free rein to command. However, this was a totally different war and none were more familiar than him with the combat mode of the hot weapon war. In this case, all he could do was to use all of his knowledge to make a detailed plan of action. In order to ensure that his forces would be winning the war, Roland ordered Lightning to shuttle between Longsong's stronghold and Bordertown every day. Her purpose was to observe the road situation and calculate the accurate distance. As for Roland, he firmly believed that the prerequisites for winning the war were plenty of calculations and reconnaissance. No matter whether tactical decision or game deduction, both were heavily dependent on these 2 points. Using the size he had set when casting the cannon last time, several sticks of gavelocks and poles of hemp ropes were made, which were 1 meter and 100 meters long respectively. Then, about 1,000-meter-long runway was marked out on the cannon test field in the west of Bordertown according to the shadows of the hemp ropes and gavelocks. Lightning, at the same time, was herself practicing on controlling the consumption of magic power so as to pass through this 1,000-meter distance between Longsong's stronghold and Bordertown at a fixed speed. After she had a good command of magic power output on such a level, Roland set about measuring the distance between Long Song's stronghold and the small town. He figured out that the distance between the two places was approximate 54 kilometers by using a sundial to calculate the round-trip duration. Of course, that was only in a straight-line distance. In reality, they would need to pass through two sharp bends to avoid the stretched foothill from the impassable mountain range. Anyhow, it would take at least 3 days to arrive at bordered town if the Duke chose a land march. The strategic location and the tactical operations of the enemy would be clearly assessed by Roland when Lightning acted as an investigator. The signifiers with distance marks were bestrewed everywhere within 2 kilometers in the west of the small town. As long as the enemies came into sight, the artillery squad could quickly adjust the corresponding angle of the muzzle. He was now concerned about what to do if the enemies did not come. Right at this moment, he heard someone knocking on the bedroom door. Nightingale, who was lying on the sofa chair and eating dried fish, went invisible instantly. Roland coughed twice and said, "Come in." It was Assistant Minister Baruf, who opened the door and said, "Your Highness, a noble from Long Song's stronghold wants to meet you." "Who? Did they send a messenger again?" Roland asked, seeming a little confused. "No, not a messenger. It's Baron Cornelius who left before the months of demons and has come back now." Baruf shook his head and answered. Roland remembered after a moment that there were indeed some nobles of Long Song's stronghold who lived in bordered town. Did they dare to come back? It was just the beginning of the spring. Didn't they experience the strong hand of the royal dictatorship? Roland thought. "Why does he want to meet me?" he asked. His house, which hindered the defending of the city wall, was demolished. "If you're reluctant to meet him, I shall let him go." The assistant minister threw up his hands and said. "Usher him into the reception room," Roland said, who would have wanted to reject him but suddenly changed his mind. It was possible to put some pressures on Long Song's stronghold through him, the prince thought. Roland came to the reception room after a moment of delay, while the man with the chubby belly was walking back and forth impatiently by the long table, and the flesh on his face was trembling with his steps. Seeing Roland walk in, the Baron stopped to reluctantly give a bow toward Roland. "Sit down," Roland said, and then went to the seat of honor. Usually, even though it was not the time for a meal, he would let the cooks offer some dessert. But not even a cup of tea was prepared today. "Respectful Highness," Baron Cornelius said hurriedly without sitting on the table. "How could you let those foolish stonemasons tear my house apart? It was a superior residence with the brickwork parapet wall as the foundation. The beam column and the roof were built in logs of the best quality. I remembered it took me 150 gold royals when I built it," he said and gesticulated with fingers. 150 gold royals. When Roland first got aboard a town, he probably would have believed these words if he was reliant on the prince's memory. "So," Roland thought and smiled. "You mean the residence in the westernmost part of town?" he asked. Cornelius nodded and said, "Yes. Yes. It was that house which was only inferior to the residence of Baron Simon. What a pity. The house was too close to the city wall and was in the way of my soldiers. But City Hall has made compensation to it." Roland paused a moment and said. "So, how much?" Cornelius asked. 20 gold royals, Roland said and gestured with 2 fingers. "Your Highness, it's too little." Cornelius opened his mouth and seemed to say something, but nothing came out. He took his handkerchief out, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and then said, "Okay, 20 is okay. Where should I go to get the money?" "Get the money?" "The money had been granted to the owner of the house long ago," Roland said, pretending to be confused by the Baron's words. "What? Why wait? I'm the owner of the house." "No. It's not you. The owner of the house is Brian, the captain of the 2nd Militia Squadron." "Who's he?" "Your Highness, you've got it wrong. I'm the owner of that house," the Baron yelled. But I didn't see you in the winter. How could you say that house was yours?" Roland frowned and asked. "I most certainly went to Long Song's stronghold. Who would stay in this damnable place?" It was possible to be killed by the demonic beasts at any time, said the Baron. I know it, Roland thought, but he still said calmly, so, what you want to say was that you were frightened by the demonic beasts and left your lord to escape by yourself, right? I. The Baron was speechless suddenly. Come in, guards. Roland clapped his hands and said. 2 guards came in immediately from the outside of the reception room and caught Cornelius in the center. Your Highness, what does that mean? It's easy. Now you have 2 choices. The first one is that you admit that you got it wrong and the house was not yours. I could just take it as a joke and let you go. The second one is that you admit that you betrayed your lord and left your domain to flee to Longsong's stronghold without permission. I would put you in jail and you'd be sentenced to the crime of defection, to be hanged, said Roland, who stood up and looked at the Baron contemptuously. The sweat dripped continuously from Cornelius's forehead. He swallowed and said after a moment of hesitation, Your Highness, I got confused. It's not my house. So, you mean it's a misunderstanding? Send the Baron out. Roland shrugged his shoulders and instructed the guards. The prince called Cornelius out when he walked to the door and then said, Oh, yes, I have a message for you to take with you when you return to Longsong's stronghold by boat. Tell those nobles who have the same misunderstandings as you, that if they won't admit that they've betrayed their lord and fled to other places without permission, they don't have to come back here again. It's a waste of time. As you wish, Cornelius said, smiling reluctantly. But having turned back, Roland saw Cornelius gnashing his teeth. By delivering my message, the chaos, presumably, would be inevitable in Longsong's stronghold, he thought. Chapter 95, The Encounter. Damn it. What a fucking prince. A poor fish that deserved to be exiled in such a barren wasteland. Cornelius thought angrily. But the guards with swords in their hands frightened him and he could only swallow his hatred. Walking out from the gate of the castle, the Baron sighed in relief as he saw the guards turn to leave. He took the wet handkerchief in order to wipe his forehead, spat on the ground and imagined that he had spat on the face of the prince. It seemed that spitting was not enough to comfort him and he trod on his spit as if he were treading on the prince. Even though you warded off the demonic beasts, do you think you could gain a firm foothold in the western region? I'll let you have your moment. Let's see for how long it'll last. If I were not receiving reliable information, I wouldn't have come to Border Town so early, Cornelius thought to himself. Generally speaking, the nobles would come back to the town later than the civilians. After all, the strenuous work of mining and hunting were not their responsibilities. All they needed to do was to monitor the production progress every now and then, and wait for the date of the ore delivery. In their spare time, they would also go to the hunter's family to purchase some furs of superior quality. But something changed this year. Cornelius heard from the financial director Sir Reynolds that Duke Ryan prepared to expel Prince Roland from the western region. It was not in betrayal of the Kingdom of Greycastle but in obedience to the will of the new king, Timothy Wimbledon. Roland Wimbledon would no longer be the Lord of Border Town, and the new fief would be conferred upon after he returned to the King's City to report his work. As the superstar of the Duke, Sir Reynolds spent only 5 years to be promoted from the municipal administrative governor to the financial director. Had he not relied on his connections with distant relatives and bribed them with furs, he would not have known the intention of the hierarchy of the western region. It was just an excuse going under the name of conferring with new fief after returning to the King's City to report his work. Even Cornelius knew that the prince would be guillotined without opportunities to explain his behavior. If Prince Roland went back, he would be at the mercy of the new king, Timothy Wimbledon. Without any doubt, the western region would still be under the jurisdiction of the Duke. If it was only His Majesty Timothy who gave the order, the matter may be under debate. If Duke Ryan handled the matter in person, Roland Wimbledon would not be any different from a stray cur. That was why Cornelius came to Border Town in haste. On the one hand, he wanted to purchase some furs of superior quality, on the other hand, he planned to sell his house. Over the past years, The common people would take refuge in Longsong's stronghold. It was understandable that there would be no furs in stock. But it was totally different this year because they did not leave here. Anyhow, they would stock some good furs. He could not only make some money by reselling the furs but also choose some superior furs to please Sir Reynolds. The second reason was to thank Sir Reynolds for helping Cornelius arrange a job in the city hall. Even a sinecure would be better off than staying in this poor area. The house was useless to him and therefore he wanted to sell it as soon as possible. No one knew when the Duke would take action to deal with Roland. If these lowlifes made a last-ditch struggle and burned his house into ashes, it would be not a good deal. But what he did not think of was that his house was torn apart by Prince Roland instead of being burned down by those lowlifes. Cornelius would be mad as a wet hen with the thought of this. What a good house! Although 150 gold royals was a little expensive, it valued at least 30 gold royals. In order to get the compensation of the house as soon as possible, he had made the compromise to receive only 20 gold royals. How could His Highness treat him like this? He paid nothing for it but also threatened that he had committed a crime of defection. Did not he know all the nobles would withdraw from here every month of demons? Hold on. Cornelius slowed down and suddenly felt there was something different with the prince. He had heard that Prince Roland was of evil nature and was whimsical. His behavior of deliberately molesting Mrs. Simon when he first arrived at Border Town was regarded as a joke among the nobles. His impression, however, was that the prince was not as he had heard before. The prince did not fly into a rage or reject the value of the house but used another seemingly reasonable excuse. He spoke in a calm voice all the way, but Cornelius was so scared that he obediently gave up his ownership to the house. Would the prince have killed him if he insisted that he was the owner of the house? At the thought of his talk with the prince, Cornelius could not help but shiver. He had a feeling like he was talking with the Duke. Cornelius shook his head and put this unhappy memory behind him. Anyhow, Prince Roland would be in trouble soon. He would absolutely laugh at him when Duke Ryan took over Border Town and remanded him to the king's city. Perhaps he could turn to the Duke for justice at the cost of 20 gold royals. He felt relieved at the thought of this. Now that he had collected several furs of superior quality, and his house had been occupied by others, he thought that he would better go to Longsong's stronghold. It was really a brazen to say tell those nobles who had the same misunderstanding as you. When I go back to Longsong's stronghold, I'll be certain to tell others how pretentious Roland was. Cornelius brushed against a lady in a hood when he left the castle district and walked down the long slope. He should not have felt so surprised. The women were all dressed in this way among the townspeople in the town. It was in the king's city that he could see beautiful girls or ladies. Cornelius was really stunned when he saw the wind blowing a corner of the hood as if the air around had frozen. Oh my God! What a beautiful lady she was! She had aquamarine eyes and long hair. Her beauty was incomparable, even if he just had a glance at her. She would take the shine off from those princesses and debutantes. Why would she be in Border Town? He looked back and wanted to catch up to her, only to find that she was walking towards the castle district. Was she the girl of His Highness? After a moment of hesitation, the Baron finally gave up on catching up with her. He did not want to have to be connected with Prince Roland anymore. The Duke would punish the prince, and instead, he was more concerned that he should return to Longsong's stronghold. He went on board to a single-mast boat berthing in the wharf. The boatman pulled the sail, and the boat undocked from the wharf. Soon, he was underway towards Longsong's stronghold. Another extraordinary view came into the eyes of Cornelius, who was enjoying the sunshine at that moment. About 5 meters away from Border Town, he saw a crowd of people who wore the same dark brown leather armor with long wooden guns on their backs. They were standing in rows and moving forwards on the snowy ground. He could not see the overall picture of the entire line because the trees blocked his sight, but he guessed there were at least more than 100 of them. Could it be farmers that Prince Roland used for fighting against the demonic beasts? Cornelius could imagine how cold they were, even though he had never experienced it. However, they did not stop but continuously moved forward. as if the snow, at a thickness of 1 foot deep, had no influence on them. He really wanted to laugh at them, but he failed. A question, unwittingly, came to his mind. Could the knights in charge by Duke Ryan make it? Chapter 96, Leaf. Leaf would have never thought that she would have the opportunity to set foot in this real-world town. She could see many people hustling and bustling about. The cluster of brick bungalows unlocked old memories that came to her as she neared the boundary of border town. She had fled to the impassable mountain range less than half a year ago, but the scene in front of her made her feel as if she were in a strange new world. The months of demons had just ended. The people had just lived through the winter lacking in food and clothes, and they should have been in bad mental and physical shape. Leaf remembered that the Witch Cooperation Association had once passed by the slum of Silver City, and it had been awash with dead bodies. Those who were still alive appeared to be like the dead, with numb faces and awkward movements. To her surprise, the people she saw here were full of energy. Some were airing dried fish in front of their doors, and some were repairing damaged tiles on their roofs. Many virile men were talking happily and moving towards the north of the town with hoes and hammers on their backs. Under such circumstances, Leaf would pull her cap brim down over her eyes and try not to look them. As the castle was located on the hillside in the southwest corner of the town, it was very easy to find. There were no plants camouflaging it, so it would be difficult to sneak into the castle. She considered hiding in a tree trunk to avoid her enemies. However, it would draw attention if the trees were to suddenly grow and send her in. She was not skilled at the art of invisibility. After thinking it over, Leaf decided to walk into the castle above rather than hiding herself from place to place. If she were to walk directly into the castle, she would still be safe as long as Nightingale had told the truth. Even if Nightingale had lied to her and the other witches in the Witch Cooperation Association, she felt confident that she could escape the chase of the 2 guards defending the gate. Of course, it would be worse because that would mean that Nightingale had betrayed all the witches, and worked for the prince by capturing her partners. If this was the case, it was likely that she would die here. As one of the most excellent combat witches, few people could escape from Nightingale. Even the formidable Kara had no confidence to defeat Nightingale. Anyhow, Leaf had prepared for the worst. Scroll would take over her position as supervisor and lead the rest of the witches to move on. No one knew where they would go or where their homes would be. She walked slowly to the hillside and got close to the gate of the castle. The guards soon noticed her. "This is the palace of the prince. Don't approach. Stand back," they shouted. After pausing a moment, they added, "If you have something urgent to report, please walk along the road and turn left at the city hall. You'll be received by the people there." Leaf took a deep breath and took off her cap. As expected, she saw a look of surprise on their faces. "I'm a witch," she said bluntly, without waiting for them to realize this. She was prepared to fight against the guards the moment she revealed her identity. However, the guards just looked at each other, and no disgust, which was commonly seen in the common people's eyes at the hearing of witches, was on their faces. One of the guards even asked Leaf with great interest, "Can I help you, witch?" Such reaction really shocked Leaf. She repressed the outburst of excitement and said as calmly as she could, "I want to meet with Nightingale. Or, Anna and Nana would be okay too." In Nightingale's tales, witches were regulars in the castle. His Highness did not restrain the freedom of the witches, and the guards defending the castle did not discourage them from entry at the behest of Prince Roland. If what Nightingale said was true, it would be impossible that the guards did not know about them. The guard, who had queried Leaf, clapped the shoulder of his partner and said, "You keep an eye on her, and I'll go to inform His Highness." Leaf saw him walk into the gate and vanish from sight. She wondered what would be waiting for her. Her sister's greeting? Besieging from the guards? Or a backstage fight? She fell into self-contradiction. She wanted to believe Nightingale, but the closer she came to the truth, the more she was afraid that Nightingale would disappoint her. Is it possible that Nightingale has changed her name here? Or Anna and Nana are just concocted names? Or, She waited for her fate quietly. She had never felt time go by so slowly. It felt as if she were waiting for centuries. She was not sure how much time had passed when she heard Nightingale's voice. She thought there was something wrong with her ears. A familiar figure appeared from the doorway. It was Nightingale, who rushed to embrace her and then took her into her warm arms. "Welcome home, Leaf," said Nightingale. "These are my spare clothes, and you can wear them," Nightingale said, rummaging through her closet. "Here's a coat, shoes. Yes, you also need a night robe and bath towel," she added. "Don't get so excited. She'll get settled when His Highness wakes up," Wendy said with a smile and shook her head. Leaf was deeply touched at the sight of Nightingale helping her to settle in. She sniffed and wiped at the tears that flowed out. She was afraid that she could not help crying once she spoke. Nightingale had not lied to her. There really was a prince who was kind to witches. "How about taking a hot shower? You must feel tired. It's a really long distance from the camp to the castle. His Highness is taking a nap. He'll be glad to see you when he wakes up. Have you found Holy Mountain? How about the other sisters?" Nightingale asked. She put the bath towel and other clothes around Leaf. Tears blurred Leaf's vision after this battery of questions. She could not help sobbing in Nightingale's arms to release the sadness burning deep within her heart. Leaf did not calm down until her tears had soaked Nightingale's clothes. Then, she told of their experiences after the three witches had left the Witch Cooperation Association. She could feel Nightingale clenching her fists when she heard about many witches dying in barbarian land. "I didn't expect Kara to bring the Witch Cooperation Association into an impasse. Only 7 sisters survived among the 42 witches. I'm to blame for the matter. If I had stood firmly at Nightingale's side, they might still be," said Wendy after Leaf told the whole experiences of the witches, with an extremely sad and serious look. "You're not to blame. No one could foresee the future. What's important now is what to do next," said Nightingale sadly. She looked at Leaf and asked, 6 sisters survived? Where are they?" "They're waiting for my message at the entrance to the canyon. We've made a plan that Scroll would lead them to leave for the Southern Horn or go across the straits if I won't be able to return. We should take them back right now. I'm on my way." "Wendy, please, take care of Leaf," said Nightingale. "But, what do you do if they don't believe you? You should go with Leaf and Lightning. She's practicing flying in the western part of the town. You can ride on horses, so the sisters walk less," Wendy suggested carefully. "But isn't the prince sleeping? Shouldn't you ask him?" Leaf asked with confusion. "Take it easy. His Highness will be happier if he knows," Nightingale assured her. Chapter 97, New Witches, New Abilities Part 1. Roland walked into the office and was surprised to find that Wendy, instead of Nightingale, was waiting for him. "What happened?" He poured himself a cup of warm water and said, "Where is Nightingale?" "She went to meet our sisters." "I see," said Roland, about to drink, but suddenly he felt something was wrong. "Wait a minute, what sisters?" "The sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association. They're coming to Border Town," Wendy replied. "Weren't they going to look for the Holy Mountain?" He stood up abruptly. "How many of them are coming? And what about that witch who wanted to hurt Nightingale? I remember she was called Kara the Snake Witch. Is she also coming?" "No, Your Highness. They failed to find the Holy Mountain. In the barbarian region, they were attacked by terrible monsters, and only 7 of them survived." Wendy reported Leaf's words and bowed to apologize. "You were taking a nap at that time. Please forgive me for taking the liberty and deciding that Nightingale and Lightning should go to greet them." "That's all right." Roland waved his hand to signal that it did not matter. "You know I won't blame you for such a thing. What are their abilities?" "I don't know yet, but Leaf told me that they are non-combat witches." "Maybe." Wendy hesitated and said, "They're not very useful for you." "Non-combat witches?" Roland was immediately full of expectations. Due to the restraint of the God's Stone of Retaliation and the short range of magic power, the fighting abilities of witches were actually limited. so productivity should be their strongest ability. If there was a witch who specialized in shaping objects, then he could make more sophisticated parts of machines, thus leading the town into the era of massive mechanical production. If there was a witch who was able to generate electricity, the evenings in bordered town would be as bright as daytime. Then he would become the king, marry with a witch, and attain the peak of his career. He would lead people to realize the modernization of agriculture, industry, national defense, science, and technology. How exciting that was! Your Highness, if you don't need them, Wendy whispered, as Roland's long silence made her feel nervous. No, of course not. Roland came back from his thoughts, and said, all witches are welcome in bordered town. At sunset, Nightingale returned to the castle with the Sisters of the Witch Corporation Association. And then they enjoyed a sumptuous feast prepared by Roland in the hall. Though obviously hungry, they were acting very reserved, since it was their first time dining in such a grand environment. Most of them had never met a lord before, let alone the lord here was a prince. Fortunately, besides Roland, there were also two local witches, Anna and Nana, who were demonstrating how to act properly. Lightning, the lively girl, also helped to break the ice. In the end, they were finally able to relax a little, and the conversation started to flow at dinner. Chewing a piece of toast, Roland observed the witches with interest. They were all beautiful girls with different styles, which was a gift of the magic power. Even if they were unable to contribute to the development of technology and science in the future, their beauty would be an ever-fading scenery. Since Carl had not finished the construction of the houses for them yet, they had to live temporarily in the castle. There were 4 unoccupied rooms on the second floor, so Roland arranged for 2 of them to share a room. After all, the large beds, which were originally prepared for the visiting nobility, were wide enough for them. After dinner, Roland finally asked the long-awaited question, what were their abilities? With the company of Nightingale, the witches walked into Roland's office one by one. Roland asked and recorded their abilities, and also tested the effect of their abilities by using the God's Stone of Retaliation, which was just like a modern interview. When the interview with the last witch was finally completed, he took a deep breath and stretched out. He was afraid that Nightingale would secretly stay in the office, otherwise, he would have liked to hum the song Superstar. These witches could not shape objects or generate electricity, so they could not help speed up his plan of modernization. However, they still gave him lots of pleasant surprises. The first and most important witch was Leaf. From the parchments of records on the desk, Roland picked up hers. Before adulthood, Leaf's ability was limited to speeding up the growth of plants and fruits. After she came into adult life, her ability had greatly improved, and she also attained a derivative skill. She could manipulate the plants. Her main ability could be used to improve the yield of the fruits and seeds and enhance herbal effects. Her derivative skill enabled her to change the shapes and traits of the plants. According to her description, if she poured her magic power into the plants, she could make green leaves grow on the withered branch, manipulate the weeds to bind up the enemy, and also integrate herself into a tree. The larger the plant was, the more magic power she consumed. So she would prefer to use weeds in combat, as they came into effect more quickly and cost less magic power. Her magic power was released through touching the objects, and it was able to be transmitted through materials, with a range of about 5 meters. There was no doubt that the witch with green long hair would be a good helper at developing agriculture, and her importance was self-evident. To realize industrialization, a large population was required, which depended on an adequate supply of food. The food should be either produced in his domain or imported from other countries. If they did not invent an effective way to cultivate crops, then most of their labor would be tied to the land. As for the latter option, it was difficult to import food due to the poor condition of transportation in this era. But now that he discovered a druid, he had the hope to support a large industrial population with the labor of only a few farmers, and therefore, accelerate the industrialization in his domain. With this in mind, He decided to make Leaf practice more on improving the quality of wheat and barley seeds. If their yield was enhanced, then it would be a great help to increase the upper limit of the population in his domain. In addition, he heard that there were some unique crops in fjords, much likely to be potato and corn, according to Lightning's description. If that was true, then introducing these crops should be placed at the top of the agenda. After all, wheat and barley were not high-yield crops. Roland wrote down a practice plan for Leaf, put her record aside, and drew the second parchment from the desk. The second witch who came to answer his questions was called Scroll. She was the oldest one among the 7 witches, nearly 40 years old. This was a really rare age for a witch. The older they were, the more difficult it was to resist the bite of magic power. But hearing her description of her ability, Roland could understand why she had been able to reach the age. Her ability was having an extraordinary memory. After she entered adulthood and her ability became stable, she could remember almost anything she saw. At the same time, she developed an interesting derivative skill. She was able to materialize any book she had read for a short period. Roland named this skill as Book of Illusion. Since she used her main ability almost all the time, she could easily go through the days of awakening. And that was also why she became so knowledgeable, even though she came from a poor family. The ability greatly strengthened her learning, especially the reading of books which required a good memory. To use her derivative skill, most of her magic power would be consumed, and when the remaining magic power ran out, the Book of Illusion would disappear, usually in half a quarter to 2 hours. Obviously, Scroll was a natural teacher. If in the future he wanted to make education universal, she would be a teacher who could teach any subjects. As for now, Roland thought, she did not need any special practice. So he would teach her some primary knowledge of mathematics and physics when he had spare time. When the time came, she would make a great contribution to the field of education. Chapter 98, New Witches, New Abilities Part 2. The third witch was Hummingbird. She was small, just as her nickname depicted. She acted more reserved than the other witches when Roland asked about her ability. She just reached adulthood this winter and was a cute girl with symmetrical dimples, a delicate face and a sweet soft voice. Her ability was Object Lightning, which meant that she was able to greatly lower the weight of an object once she put her magic power into it. According to her description, the weight of an object would be close to 0. Roland asked her to demonstrate it with his teacup and found that the teacup almost floated in the air, that was to say, its weight was close to that of air. Of course, in the eyes of people in that era, air was weightless. That was the reason why the Witch Cooperation Association was able to cross the western region of Greycastle without worrying about food supplies. With the magic power of Hummingbird, bags of wheat and dried fish would become light enough for the witches. In that way, they could easily take a lot of food with them, which significantly relieved the pressure on supplies. Though Hummingbird had entered her adulthood, she still had not developed any derivative skill. Her magic power would come into effect only when she touched the object, which could not be a living entity. The larger the object was, the more time and magic power it consumed. However, once she successfully reduced its weight, the effect would last for several hours. The ability seemed to be perfect for transportation, and it would also be a large advantage in the coming war. Anyway, there were still too many unknown factors, and he needed to conduct further research. Roland wrote at the bottom of her parchment, "Practice with stones of different weights and control the output of magic power so as to determine precisely the effective time of the magic power." After completing the first 3 practice plans, he ordered his attendant to bring another candle, making the room brighter. But even with this, in the waving orange candlelight, reading and writing were very tiring for his eyes. Roland made a yawn and flattened the parchment with the information of the 4th witch. She was different from other witches as she had a surname, and her full name was Saray Azuan. She was born in a merchant family from the king's city of Greycastle. She had short brown curly hair and a pair of slender eyes. The freckles on top of her nose did not destroy her beauty, instead, they added a unique youthful vigor to her. Soraya just turned 19 and she also had a special ability. After she became an adult, she was able to paint everything she saw or imagined. With her derivative skill, the magic pen, she was able to paint without pigment or paper, and her painting would be exactly like a photo. Roland could list hundreds of ways to use this ability. As for her practice, he would ask her to paint several pictures every day. He then picked up the next parchment. The fifth witch, Echo, came from the southernmost region. She was a tall girl with a brown complexion, and her eyes and nose, which showed that she was a typical citizen of Sand Nation, gave her a very exotic charm. According to her description, she could imitate the call of any animal when she just awoke as a witch, and after she entered adulthood, she could skillfully imitate any sound in the world. She did not have any derivative skill. Roland named her ability as Magic Sound, but did not figure out its usage yet. As for her training plan, maybe she could shout as loudly as possible. The sixth witch was Lily, a 16-year-old girl with 2 ponytails and a doll-like delicate face. When she sat in front of Roland, she was quite nervous. Her ability was to prevent food from rotting, so she had become the most popular role in the Witch Cooperation Association since she awoke a year ago. Without food preservation, a lot of food would become sour and moldy during the journey. Lily, as well as Hummingbird, guaranteed the food supply of the Witch Cooperation Association. Whether she killed the bacteria by her magic power to keep food fresh or not was still to be confirmed. Roland decided to ask her to practice on all kinds of meat and fruits, and to confirm the duration of the preservation effect after the magic power ran out. Rubbing his stiff neck, he piled up the previous parchments. Only one parchment was left on the desk. And that was another pleasant surprise for Roland. The seventh witch was called Mystery Moon. She was obviously nervous when she walked into the office. Nightingale reassured her for a while and later whispered into Roland's ears to simply explain her situation. Among all the witches in the camp, Mystery Moon had the worst ability, which could be described as useless. Because of that, she was only able to do some chores which could also be easily completed by manual work. In addition, she was often blamed by Kara, so she had become very timid. She was afraid that Roland would also think that she was useless and hence drive her away from Bordered Town. Her ability was magnetizing objects. Before she entered adulthood, she could only magnetize metal objects, but now she was able to magnetize any object. She did not have any derivative skill. She had to touch the object to magnetize it in an extremely slow way. As she described, it cost her half a day to magnetize a stone of about a cubic foot. Her ability was indeed useless for the Witch Cooperation Association. The magnet was not rare in that era. For example, every huge ship sailing between the fjords and the continent was equipped with a compass for navigation. On the continent, people did not need any compass to tell the direction as they could easily find other references. On the contrary, the magnetized objects would cause trouble to others. For example, the metal pots which were lightened by Hummingbird would accidentally fly toward the magnetized objects of Mystery Moon. For this reason, she was forbidden by Kara to use her ability in the camp. But for Roland, this silent girl was a priceless gift. That was why he would like to hum that song, Superstar. Was there any words more appropriate than the lyric of "You are electricity, you are light"? Electricity would be generated in the magnetic field, and electricity would also create a magnetic field in reverse. It was known by every student who had learned physics. Roland expressed his sincere gratitude to Faraday, Gauss, Ampere, and Maxwell in his heart. With electricity, there would also be light. Maybe he did not have to wait for long to create another miracle in his domain. As a witch who was forbidden to use her ability, Mystery Moon was still able to survive from the demonic torture. It showed that she was not mentally fragile though she appeared timid. At least she had more desire to live on than others. Roland was secretly thankful that she had just joined the association for nearly a year, or she might be ruined under Kara's rule if she had been restrained for a longer time. With these thoughts, He wrote down Mystery Moon's practice plan for the following days. She would magnetize a variety of objects to confirm the relationship between the consumption of magic power and the strength of their magnetism. After adding these 7 witches, Roland now had a total of 12 witches working for him. Through inquiring about their abilities, he got a fair idea of the magic power. The traditional classification of combat type and non-combat type was unreasonable, and he preferred to classify them according to the characteristics of their abilities. In general, the main abilities of the witches could be divided into 3 types. The first type was the self-strengthening type, which was very rare. Up to now, he only knew Skrull belonged to this type. Her ability would come into effect automatically, so it would not be influenced by God's Stone of Retaliation. Even if she was forced to wear the stone, she could still have a photographic memory. The second one was the summoning type, and Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Lightning, Wendy, Leaf, Soraya, Echo, and Lily all belonged to this type. Their magic power could be summoned outside of their body within 5 meters with various abilities. This type of witches was also most restrained by the God's Stone of Retaliation. Once they stepped into the forbidden area where their magic power was suppressed, any magic effects would disappear. However, before the magic power was suppressed, the results it caused would be everlasting and irreversible. The third one was the attaching magic type. For example, Hummingbird and Mystery Moon fell into this type. They had to get contact with their target to complete the slow conversion, which consumed lots of magic power and could be interrupted by God's Stone of Retaliation. But once the conversion was completed, the added properties would become inherent, which meant that they would still be effective even within the forbidden area. The duration of enchantment depended on the size of the object and the amount of magic power. Maybe this was why the God's Stone of Retaliation could not relieve the bite of the magic power, he thought. God's Stone of Retaliation was unable to affect the gathering and flowing of the magic power. Instead, it affected its transformation of magic power into ability. Described in computer terms, it affected the forend of clients instead of the backstage data. Roland put down the quill pen and rubbed his eyes. Anyway, he knew he would become even busier in the future. Chapter 99, The Night Chat. The witches were still awake. After having suffered for so long, they still couldn't believe that they were being accommodated by the prince and that there were neither shackles nor guards. The prince even allowed everyone to enter the castle and live in such spacious and comfortable rooms. Wendy probably guessed the anxiety of the sisters. Together with Nightingale, she called everyone to gather in her room and sit around the bed in a circle. They would have a chat to calm down their emotions. This is the style of a leader, Leaf thought. If it was Gara, she would never be so attentive to the needs of the sisters. Even if she had noticed, she would never have bothered to comfort them. Sister Wendy, what will His Royal Highness ask us to do? Hummingbird timidly asked. Our abilities are far worse than you and Sister Nightingale. This struck a chord with the other sisters, and they all nodded in support. Wendy began to laugh. Let me think about it. The first thing you have to do is to practice your abilities. Practice our abilities? Soraya asked hesitantly. Will His Royal Highness ask me to draw paintings all day long? It's quite possible. Wendy patted Mystery Moon on the head. Although Kara forbids you to use your abilities in the camp, His Highness won't. On the contrary, he'll encourage you to practice and master your abilities. My ability will only bring troubles to my sisters, said Mystery Moon. Even so, you must still practice, said Wendy, and it's a matter of life and death. Life and death? Leaf could not help but ask. Yes, His Highness discovered the way for witches to safely get through the Day of Awakening, said Nightingale, who continued after Wendy. From now on, we can say goodbye to the pain of the demonic bite and all sisters can live to adulthood. All the witches were now staring at Nightingale. At that moment they couldn't believe their ears. Skrull asked in surprise, are you speaking about what happened to Miss Anna? But last time, you told us that you did not know the specific reason. Yes, at that time it was only the speculation of His Highness, but Nana's Awakening Day verified this. She also didn't suffer any harm. So the method is. Scroll could not help but hold her breath. You just need to expend your magic power every day, Nightingale said slowly word by word. I can see the changes of the magic power in the mist. Regular use of it will increase the total capacity of the body. At the same time, the suffering during the demonic bites will also be reduced. As it draws close to the day of awakening, as long as the magic power is exhausted, it'll almost cause no harm to the body. I think everyone can sense it faintly as well, Wendy added. During the days when we were hunted by the church, we would carefully hide in the corners of town and did not dare to use our abilities. Therefore, we lost many sisters every winter. But this year, while living in the camps in the impassable mountain range, besides Frere and Abby, everyone else was able to survive the months of the demons. So that's the reason. Thinking about this, Leaf took a deep breath. When she had encountered the demonic bite while traveling through barbarian land, its duration was exceptionally short. In other words, Holy Mountain isn't in that barren land. That's right, the Holy Mountain isn't a specific place. Wendy nodded. Any place where people can accept us, without seeing the witches as the devil or limiting the sisters practicing their abilities, will be Holy Mountain. Wendy had even asked His Highness if she could go to the camp when the months of the demons had ended to tell you the news. Nightingale glanced at Wendy and said gently, in this case, even if you hadn't found Holy Mountain, you could still live well in the mountains. Since everyone has come back, there's no need to mention this. Wendy smiled and shook her head. Regardless of whether you're needed by His Highness or not, you should still practice every day for safety. If this is the key to resolve the bite of magic power, shouldn't there be other witches who would have been aware of this? Scroll thought for a moment and said, we're not the first witch organization. There are other witch organizations in Kingdom of Dawn and the Kingdom of Wolfheart. I have sent them letters to invite them to find Holy Mountain together. However, we have never received a reply. Leaf sighed gently, and she knew Scroll held back on what she wanted to say. Ever since Gara found the ancient book in the ruins of the forest at the eastern border, she firmly believed in Holy Mountain and took everyone on her endeavor. At this point, the Witch Cooperation Association started their long journey of exile, almost across the entire kingdom of Grey Castle. During the journey, they met many new sisters but also lost many of them. If from the beginning they had decided to hide in the ruins, would they have discovered this key? We can try to contact the hidden witches in other cities, said Nightingale, and it's part of His Highness's plan. He also wants to let the witches notice this remote town by spreading the rumors. If we become the middle person, it would no doubt greatly reduce their suspicion. However, I still don't understand why His Highness wants to accommodate us, asked Echo, looking confused. The witch from the southernmost region had suffered more than most of the other witches. First, she was sold by the people of Sand Nation to a businessman from Port of Clearwater, who then took her all the way to sell her again in King's City. She was forced to learn dancing, royal etiquettes, and even the skills to please a man. If she wasn't coincidentally rescued by the Witch Cooperation Association, she would probably have been sold for an exorbitantly high price to a duke or minister. Until now, she still had her foreign accent when speaking. Maybe just like those who wanted to buy you. Lily sneered. Man. Don't speak nonsense, Lily, said Nightingale in a stern voice. His Highness is clearly different from all those people that you talked about. As long as you stay here for a while, you'll understand. It's true, I have experienced it deeply, Wendy said while wearing her kind smile. It's already late, so everyone should go back to their rooms and try to get some sleep. Don't worry even if your ability isn't useful to His Highness. He said that he wants all of you to be able to live a normal life in Bordered Town. If you want to know what His Highness will ask you tomorrow. She deliberately paused for a moment. I guess, it'll start from the signing of a contract. After Leaf and Scroll returned to their room and closed their door, the latter said, we should sleep as well. When His Highness had asked about her ability earlier, he arranged for her to stay in the same room as Scroll. He also mentioned that this was only a temporary arrangement, and in the future, she could have a brand new room for herself. But in her view, the bed was already spacious enough for 3 people. She took off her coat and got under the quilt. It was hard to describe the softness and comfort that wrapped around her body. Leaf could not help but moan gently with her head buried in the pillow. After a long time, she softly asked, "Do you blame Kara?" Scroll sighed. No one can predict the future, no matter what she did at the end. At least in the beginning she was really genuine in wanting to find a home for the witches to live in peace. Now there's no point mentioning this. Sleep well, my girl. She closed her eyes. Good night. Chapter 100, The Ancient Book and the Relic Part 1. The next morning, all the witches were led downstairs by their maids. Like Wendy had said, each of them was given a roll of fine parchment by the prince after breakfast. In consideration of the fact that some witches were illiterate, Scroll explained what the contents were on the parchment. After that, everybody signed and put their fingerprints on it. Roland knew that they barely understood what the contract really entailed. But it did not matter, as he believed they would eventually learn its meanings. He was also pretty sure that these witches would even be willing to sign all their rights away given the present circumstances. Nevertheless, he did not think it was a bad deal to provide a relatively generous offer. Since he had decided to officially employ witches, he must look at the big picture. All that he had done so far was to create a virtuous, sustainable cycle that would benefit both parties in the long run. After everybody handed in the signed contracts, Roland told each of them their individual training schedule which he drafted the night before. He then asked Leaf, Scroll and Soraya to come to his office with him. Nightingale soon revealed herself and winked at the other witches after Roland closed the door. "I've been thinking about what Wendy told me yesterday." Roland pulled the curtains to let the bright sun rays shine through the window. "She said you came across some hideous, horrible monsters from which only 7 of you managed to escape. Even the supervisor of the Witch Cooperation Association, Kara, died in the wilderness. I wonder what exactly you encountered? Demonic hybrids?" Leaf broke off first. "No, they were not demonic hybrids, but demons from the gates of hell. They got big statures and could summon demonic beasts. They had magic power as well, just like..." She hesitated for a moment. "Like us? Demons?" Roland knitted his brows and glanced at Soraya. "Were you there at that time?" Soraya nodded. "You can sketch out what happened that day, can you?" Roland handed her a piece of paper. Soraya shut her eyes, appearing to be a little anguished. But she took the paper and walked to the desk. As she summoned her power, an obscure quill emerged in her hand, whose tip emanated a beautiful rainbow glow. The quill soon sprang up and started to draw automatically. Soraya kept her eyes firmly shut. Gradually, a vivid picture appeared on the paper. Roland approached the desk and saw the drawing was so lifelike that it was more like a photograph than a picture. Like a video camera, Soraya's ability enabled her to reconstruct the murder scene and relate the story on barbarian land from the first-person point of view. By the time the painting was done, Soraya's forehead had been beaded with perspiration. Apparently, the memory of the incident agonized her like a prolonged nightmare. At this point, Nightingale also joined the conversation. "Are they demons?" "Yes." Leaf pointed to the one closer to her. "This one with metal gloves could summon lightning to attack us. He was also physically strong and powerful. More than half a dozen sisters were killed by him. The one father could shoot spears several times faster than bolts. They couldn't, however, launch continuous attacks. During such intervals, I managed to kill them." "By yourself?" Roland asked. "Kara's snake of magic bit and broke the leather tube underneath this demon's helmet. She later died with the demon together. The tube turned out to be the demon's weak point, so I killed the other demon using the same method with my hand crossbow. There seemed to be some red gases in the tube. The demons didn't die until all the gases ran out." Leaf pointed at the neck of the gloved demon and said. Roland could not figure out why there was such kind of creatures in the wilderness. They were definitely not extraterrestrial beings, for, From the patched leather tube that functioned like an oxygen tank and the animal skin garb they wore, one could tell that demons were by no means from a higher civilization. Whether by means of scientific technologies or magic, the ability to visit another planet itself was a piece of solid evidence of power. In the case of human beings, it took men tremendous efforts just to land the moon. Of course, the demons might also come from some queer civilization outside his knowledge, who had come to this world by some quirk of fate. Above all, now Roland knew that demons were not invulnerable enemies who could not be killed. Apart from the demons, we also saw a city in the air. Leaf continued, it was always there at the front no matter how hard we tried to get close to it. Lightning once mentioned the phenomenon in one of her adventure stories. She said it seemed to be a mirage. Can you draw it? Roland asked Soraya. Soraya nodded and summoned the magic pen again. After that, she painted the air-built city that Leaf had just talked about on the paper. Roland looked at the picture carefully, but could not obtain much information out of the blurry drawing. If what they had seen was really a mirage, the real city must be somewhere on barbarian land. As to the blood mists that obscured the sky above the city, they could be the breathing gases demons relied on. This explanation appeared to be more reliable than the alien theory. After all, the impassable mountain range was a mysterious area never imprinted with the foot of man. It was perfectly normal that some other races lived there. Now, the only question left was regarding the ancient book. Nightingale and Wendy told me that Kara decided to seek Holy Mountain because of an ancient book. He asked, Scroll, have you read that book before? Scroll hesitated for a while and answered, Kara didn't allow any of us to read that book. But I once stole a peek at it. The contents are bewildering and at the same time incredible. Can you make a copy of it? Let me take a look. What the book says isn't true, Your Highness. The non-existence of Holy Mountain has already shown it's a lie. Scroll sighed and raised her right hand. I hope you won't be too absorbed by what's written. A gilded book emerged in the air, with its front and back covers spread open. The book pages in between swiftly flipped through. It then abruptly closed and descended on Scroll's hand. Your Highness, I hope you read it alone because I don't want the rest of our sisters to become as stubborn and radical as Kara. Roland took the book and replied, Got it. After all the witches left the office, Nightingale silently showed up by the couch. She raised the skirt of her robe, cocked her feet on the stool and then started to chew dried fish like she always did. Don't you want to take a look? Roland asked her smilingly. Nightingale dismissed it contemptuously. I'm not interested in what a crazy old witch was obsessed with. Roland shook his head and returned to the desk. He opened the book with great care as if the book had possessed some real magic power. Just like what Scroll had said, most of the contents were difficult and inarticulate. It appeared that the wording and the grammars were also out of date. The book recorded everything from the Bloody Moon to the giant stone gate, but just not Holy Mountain. In fact, other than a few phrases here and there, the rest was simply a bunch of jibber-jabbers. To conclude, Roland recognized every single word in the book, but could not make any sense out of them. He wondered whether the missing information resulted from the hasty manner in which Scroll had read the book, or the book was simply incomplete as it was. Roland ignored the tedious paragraphs in the middle and directly skipped to the end. Only the first few pages of the big book contained some contents. The latter part of the book, however, was totally blank. On the last page, the handwriting changed abruptly. The earlier neat handwriting suddenly turned into a sort of scribbles, as if the author had written them in a rush. The contents, nonetheless, started to become clearer and more coherent. The first sentence read, We failed. It was impossible for common people to defeat demons.